I still remember the sound of laughter when my father raised his glass at my brother's wedding and called me a desk soldier in front of 300 people. The cameras were rolling, the champagne was flowing, and my father, a disgraced former military officer who'd spent years blaming me for his failures, finally had his moment to publicly destroy whatever dignity I had left. "To Nathan," he announced proudly, his arm around my golden child brother, "our true success story. And to Erica, our desk soldier who files papers somewhere in the government." The room erupted. My brother's wealthy in-laws smirked. Even my own mother looked away. I was the family embarrassment, the daughter who'd chosen military service over marriage ambition, over obedience. The forgotten one. But then the doors opened. A convoy of black Pentagon vehicles pulled up outside. And when General Marcus Dalton, four-star general, my father's potential business partner, and the man my dad was desperately trying to impress, walked into that reception, everything changed. He scanned the room until his eyes found me sitting quietly in the back. Then in front of everyone, he smiled and said 5 words that made my father's face go white. "Colonel Wells, it's an honor." What happened next didn't just destroy my father's carefully crafted lies. It exposed secrets that would tear our family apart, reveal a betrayal that cost lives, and force me to choose between the blood that raised me and the truth that defined me. This is the story of how a desk soldier brought an empire to its knees without firing a single shot. And trust me, you won't believe how this ends. My name is Erica Wells. I'm 38 years old, a colonel in the United States Army, and for most of my life I've been the daughter my family wished didn't exist. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, slipped under my apartment door while I was at the Pentagon reviewing intelligence reports. I almost stepped on it when I came home that evening, my boots scuffing against the heavy cream cardstock that screamed expensive and exclusive. Nathan's wedding. Of course it would be elaborate. My younger brother had always known how to perform success, even when it was built on borrowed money and our father's desperate need for redemption. I picked up the envelope and felt its weight, the kind of invitation that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Inside, embossed letters announced the union of Nathan Richard Wells and Victoria Ann Hartwell at the Piedmont Country Club in Millbrook, Virginia, 6 weeks away. Black tie required. No +1 indicated for me, I noticed. Just my name alone on the inner envelope, as if they'd considered not inviting me at all. But it was the note tucked inside that made my hands go cold. 4 words in my father's aggressive scrawl, "Please behave this time." I stood in my small kitchen, still holding my keys, still wearing my uniform, and felt something crack open inside my chest. Not the fresh pain of a new wound, but the deep ache of an old one that never properly healed. Please behave this time. As if I'd been the problem. As if I'd been the one who'd caused scenes, made demands, ruined family gatherings with my presence. I walked to my living room and sat down heavily on the couch, the invitation still in my hand. Around me, the apartment was sparse and functional. I'd never bothered to make it feel like home. Home was supposed to be where people wanted you. This was just where I slept, between deployments, between missions, between the moments when I was actually useful to someone. On the bookshelf across from me sat my medals. 3 rows of them, each one representing a commendation, a successful operation, a moment when I'd made a difference. The Bronze Star I'd received for valor in Afghanistan. The Defense Meritorious Service Medal from my work in counterintelligence. The Army Commendation Medal with Valor device for the mission that had saved 12 lives and destroyed my father's career. That last one still felt heavy even from across the room. I looked at those medals the way someone might look at photographs of a life they'd lived in another language. They represented honor sacrifice recognition from people who mattered in my professional world. But to my family, they were just medal and ribbon, proof that I'd chosen wrong. Evidence that I'd betrayed them by being good at the one thing my father had failed at. Please behave this time. The last family gathering I'd attended was 2 years ago. Thanksgiving dinner that had started tense and ended in my father's drunken accusation that I'd always been jealous of Nathan's success. that I'd joined the military because I couldn't cut it in the real world, that I was the reason our family name meant nothing anymore in Millbrook. I'd sat there and taken it the way I always had. My mother had cried quietly into her napkin. Nathan had looked uncomfortable but said nothing in my defense. And I'd left before dessert, driving 3 hours back to base with my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel and tears I refused to let fall. I'd promised myself that day that I was done. Done apologizing for existing. Done showing up to be their convenient target. Done protecting people who'd never protected me. And yet here I was holding another invitation. Another summons to present myself for judgment. I should have thrown it away. Should have sent a polite decline with a generic excuse about military obligations. Should have done what any rational person would do when faced with people who'd spent decades making them feel worthless. But something stopped me. I stood up and walked to my bedroom closet, pulling open the door to reveal my dress uniform hanging in its protective cover. The dark blue fabric, the brass buttons, the insignia that marked me as a colonel in the United States Army. The uniform I'd earned through blood, sweat, years of proving myself in rooms full of men who assumed I couldn't. I unzipped the cover and ran my hand down the sleeve, feeling the texture of achievement under my fingers. For 2 years I'd stayed away. For 2 years I'd let them have their narrative that I was the difficult daughter, the family embarrassment, the one who'd chosen ambition over loyalty. I'd let them tell their stories about Nathan, the success, and Erica, the disappointment. But something had shifted in me during those 2 years of silence. Maybe it was turning 38 and realizing I'd spent most of my life seeking approval from people who'd never planned to give it. Maybe it was the last mission I'd led where a young female lieutenant had thanked me for showing us we belong here. Maybe it was just exhaustion at carrying other people's shame. I thought about my father's note. Please behave this time. He wanted me to show up, stay quiet, and play my role as the lesser child. He wanted me to sit in the back, wear something modest and forgettable, and not remind anyone that I existed beyond being Nathan's older sister. He wanted me to behave. A small, bitter smile crossed my face. I pulled my dress uniform from the closet and laid it on my bed. Then I sat down at my desk and wrote a single line on my RSVP card, looking forward to celebrating with the family. I didn't tell them I'd changed. I didn't warn them that the daughter who'd swallowed insults and absorbed blame had spent 2 years finding her spine. I sealed the envelope and set it by my door to mail in the morning. This time I wouldn't behave. This time I'd be myself. And I had a feeling they weren't going to like who that was. The drive to Millbrook took just under 3 hours, but it felt like traveling backward through time. I left the structured efficiency of the Pentagon behind, watching as highways narrowed into state routes, then into the 2-lane road that carved through Virginia farmland, like a scar through memory. The closer I got to my hometown, the tighter my chest became. I'd forgotten how small everything was. Or maybe I'd just gotten used to thinking in larger terms: national security, international operations, strategic implications that affected thousands of lives. Millbrook existed on a different scale entirely. Population 3,200, give or take whoever had died or been born since I'd last checked. 1 main street, 2 churches, a town where everyone knew your business before you did. The Welcome to Millbrook sign still had the same faded paint, the same cheerful declaration that this was a great place to call home. I drove past it, doing exactly the speed limit, remembering how the local sheriff used to pull over anyone he didn't recognize. He'd recognize the Wells name on my license, though. That name still meant something here, even if my first name didn't. Main Street looked frozen in time. Patterson's Hardware still had the same green awning. The Millbrook Diner still advertised their famous apple pie on a hand-painted sign. I could see Mrs. Henderson sweeping the sidewalk in front of her flower shop, the same thing she'd done every morning for as long as I could remember. She looked up as I drove past, and I saw the moment of recognition cross her face. She lifted her hand in a wave, polite, restrained, the kind of gesture you give to someone you know you should acknowledge but don't particularly want to engage with. I didn't wave back. I just kept driving. The family house sat at the end of Oakwood Drive, a large colonial that my father maintained with almost military precision. The lawn was perfectly manicured, the hedges trimmed into sharp angles, the white paint spotless. It looked like a house from a magazine spread, the kind of place that suggested the people inside had their lives together. I'd always found that ironic. I parked on the street instead of pulling into the driveway, a small act of defiance keeping my exit route clear. The September air was warm when I stepped out of my car, carrying the smell of cut grass and the faint sweetness of someone's late-blooming roses. It should have felt nostalgic. Instead, it felt suffocating. I decided to walk into town before facing the house. I needed to remember what I was dealing with, needed to feel the weight of this place before I stepped back into my family's version of reality. The Cup and Saucer was Millbrook's only coffee shop, wedged between the post office and a real estate agency that I noticed bore Nathan's company name on the window. Of course it did. I pushed open the door and the bell chimed the same cheerful note it had since I was 16. Sarah Mitchell was sitting at a corner table and her face lit up when she saw me. We'd been friends in high school back when friendship meant shared secrets and borrowed clothes rather than the deeper understanding that comes with age. She stood up and hugged me, and I felt myself stiffen slightly before returning the gesture. Erica Wells. Oh my God, I heard you were coming back for the wedding. Sarah pulled back, examining me with the kind of scrutiny that small-town women perfect over years of practice. You look amazing. Military life must agree with you. It keeps me busy, I said, sliding into the seat across from her. The coffee shop hadn't changed either. Same wooden tables, same local artwork on the walls, same menu board advertising seasonal drinks that never actually changed. Sarah launched into an enthusiastic monologue about Nathan's success, while I ordered a black coffee from the teenage waitress, who looked at me with complete disinterest. His real estate company is just booming, Sarah said, her eyes bright with the pleasure of sharing good news. He's developing that new subdivision out past the highway, and he's got properties in 3 counties now. And Victoria, oh, you'll love her. She's from one of those old money families, you know. Her father owns half of Richmond. I nodded, sipping my coffee and letting Sarah's words wash over me. This was the narrative I'd expected. Nathan the success story. Nathan the pride of Millbrook. Nathan who'd done everything right. And the wedding is going to be incredible, Sarah continued. 300 guests, I heard. Live band. Your father must be so proud. She paused, and I saw the moment she remembered she should probably ask about me. So, what about you? You still pushing papers for the army? The question landed like a slap, though I knew she didn't mean it that way. Sarah genuinely thought she was making polite conversation, asking about my job, the way you'd ask someone about their work at an insurance company or a retail store. She had no idea what I actually did. No concept of the operations I'd led, the lives I'd saved, the years I'd spent earning the respect of people who actually understood what service meant. Something like that, I said, keeping my voice neutral. We talked for another 20 minutes, though it felt longer. Sarah filled the silence with gossip and updates about people I barely remembered, and I realized that to her, to everyone in this town, I was essentially a stranger. I'd left at 18 for West Point, and had only come back for brief, uncomfortable visits over the years. I'd built an entire life, an entire identity somewhere else. To Millbrook, I was just the Wells daughter who'd never quite fit in. When I finally left the coffee shop, I walked slowly down Main Street. Through shop windows I could see people talking, laughing, living their interconnected small-town lives. I passed the bank where my father used to be on the board before his discharge. I passed the pharmacy where Nathan had worked summers during college, charming the elderly customers. I heard snippets of conversation as people talked on the sidewalk, and more than once I caught Nathan's name always spoken with admiration and approval. No one mentioned me. No one even seemed to notice me walking past. I'd served my country for 20 years. I'd earned my rank through excellence and sacrifice. I'd made decisions that saved lives and protected people who'd never know my name. But here in the town where I was born, I was invisible. They'd remember my name soon enough. The dinner was scheduled for 7 o'clock at the house, and I arrived at 6:55 wearing a simple navy dress that I knew would disappoint my father. He'd want me in something more feminine, more apologetic, something that signaled I understood my place in the family hierarchy. Instead, I'd chosen something that made me look competent and self-possessed, which I suppose was its own form of rebellion. The driveway was already crowded with expensive cars. I recognized Nathan's silver BMW and what must have been Victoria's white Mercedes. The other vehicles were equally impressive luxury sedans that probably cost more than I made in a year. I parked my modest sedan on the street again, a visual representation of how I'd always existed on the periphery of this family. My mother opened the door before I could knock, and I saw the familiar anxiety in her eyes. She'd aged in the 2 years since I'd seen her, new lines around her mouth gray threading more prominently through her brown hair. She hugged me quickly, smelling of the perfume she'd worn my entire life, and whispered, "Please just get through tonight." It was the closest she'd ever come to acknowledging that these gatherings were an ordeal. The dining room had been transformed into something from a magazine spread. Crystal glasses caught the light from the chandelier my father had insisted on installing 15 years ago. China plates that only came out for special occasions gleamed white against the dark wood table. Flowers I knew my mother had spent hours arranging formed an elaborate centerpiece. It was a performance of success of a family that had everything together. I was the last to arrive, which meant everyone turned to look at me when I entered. Nathan stood near the fireplace with Victoria, who was exactly what I'd expected. Blonde, polished, wearing pearls and a confidence that came from never having to prove herself. Her parents, Thomas and Linda Hartwell, sat on the sofa with drinks in their hands, assessing me with the kind of subtle judgment that wealthy people had perfected. My father's sister Margaret was there with her husband, both of them offering tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. And my father. Richard Wells stood at the head of the room like a general surveying his troops, even though he hadn't been a general or anything close to it. He'd been a lieutenant colonel when his career ended, and he'd been bitter about it every day since. "Erica," he said my name sounding like an accusation. "You made it." "I did," I replied, keeping my voice even. "Wouldn't miss Nathan's big day." Nathan crossed the room and hugged me, and for just a moment I remembered the little brother who used to follow me around, who'd cried when I left for West Point, who'd written me letters during my first deployment. But that boy had been replaced by this man who'd learned that loving me openly cost him our father's approval. "Glad you're here, sis," he said, and I almost believed he meant it. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. We sat around the table with its elaborate place settings, and I found myself positioned between Aunt Margaret and an empty chair, while Nathan sat at my father's right hand with Victoria beside him. The seating arrangement told its own story. My father dominated the conversation from the start, directing questions at Nathan about his business at Victoria, about her family's holdings at Thomas Hartwell, about his connections in Richmond. He was performing, I realized, trying to prove to these wealthy people that the Wells family belonged in their circle, that his son's success had erased whatever stain his own failure had left. "Nathan's really built something remarkable," my father said, gesturing with his wine glass. "Started from nothing and created an empire. That's the Wells determination right there. Knew when to focus on what matters, building a legacy in the real world." The implication hung in the air. The real world, as opposed to the military, which apparently didn't count. Victoria's mother, Linda, smiled politely. "It's so refreshing to see young people with business sense. So many these days just want to work for the government or nonprofits. No real ambition." I felt my mother's hand briefly touch my knee under the table. A warning, or perhaps an apology. "Of course Erica's in the military," my father said, and I heard the shift in his tone. "Following in the old man's footsteps, or trying to." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Though I think she's discovered it's not quite what she expected. Different world now than when I served." Aunt Margaret jumped in with forced enthusiasm. "It's wonderful that you're serving your country, dear. Even if it's just administrative work, it's still important." Just administrative work. The words settled over me like a familiar weight. Nathan looked uncomfortable pushing food around his plate. Victoria examined her manicured nails. Thomas Hartwell cleared his throat and changed the subject to golf. As the meal progressed, my father drank more wine and his performance became more pointed. He told stories about Nathan's successes, about his own military career before politics and bureaucracy, ended it about the importance of knowing when to cut your losses and find a better path. Each story felt aimed at me even when he wasn't looking in my direction. Then came dessert and champagne, and my father stood with his glass raised. The room fell silent in that expectant way people do when someone commands attention. "I want to make a toast," he announced. His cheeks flushed from wine and the pleasure of having an audience. "To my son Nathan, who had the wisdom to know when to quit the fight and focus on building something real. Who understood that true success means creating wealth, establishing a name, making something of yourself in the world that matters." He paused, and I felt the shift coming like a change in air pressure before a storm. "And to my daughter Erica, our desk soldier. She may not have built an empire, but I'm sure she files papers very efficiently somewhere in Washington. To each their own path, right?" He laughed, and others joined in uncertainly. The Hartwells exchanged glances that mixed pity and superiority. My mother's face had gone pale. Nathan stared at his plate, and I sat there feeling 20 years of humiliation crystallize into something sharp and clear. I stood slowly picking up my champagne glass. Every eye turned toward me. My father's expression held satisfaction mixed with challenge, daring me to make a scene to prove I was the difficult daughter he'd always claimed. Instead, I smiled. Calm, controlled. The smile I'd perfected in rooms full of hostile intelligence officers and foreign operatives who'd underestimated me. "To those who sit behind desks," I said quietly, my voice carrying in the sudden silence, "so others can stand on solid ground." I took a sip and sat back down. The toast hung in the air, seemingly gracious, but carrying an edge that only I fully understood. If he only knew what kind of desk I sat behind. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom with its faded wallpaper and dusty shelves, I couldn't sleep. The champagne toast replayed in my mind, but it kept blending with another moment, another humiliation that had set all of this in motion. The real reason my father's eyes held such cold hatred when he looked at me. The reason he'd spent 12 years systematically destroying my reputation within our family. It had been Afghanistan, Helmand Province, summer heat that made your uniform stick to your skin, and dust that got into everything. Your boots, your gear, your lungs. I was 26 years old, a captain leading an intelligence unit, and my commanding officer was Lieutenant Colonel Richard Wells. My father. I should have been proud. We were serving together the way military families sometimes did. He'd pulled strings to get me assigned to his command, saying he wanted to keep an eye on me and show me how real leadership worked. I'd been naive enough to think it meant he was finally proud of me. The mission briefing happened in a sweltering tent on a Tuesday morning. Our task was to extract a local informant who'd provided intelligence about Taliban supply routes. The informant, codenamed Sparrow, had requested emergency extraction after his cover was compromised. Simple enough. Get in, get him out, get back to base. But the intelligence reports I'd reviewed the night before told a different story. Intercepted communications suggested the Taliban knew about Sparrow's location and were setting up an ambush along the main route. I'd spent hours analyzing the chatter, cross-referencing it with movement patterns and known insurgent positions. The evidence was clear the direct route my father planned to use was compromised. I presented my findings at the briefing. Spread out the maps, showed him the intercepts, explained why we needed to alter the route. I was respectful, thorough professional. Everything a good intelligence officer should be. My father barely looked at the reports. "Your analysis is overly cautious, Captain," he said, his voice dismissive in front of the other officers. "The direct route is faster and time is critical. We're not changing operational plans based on vague chatter that could mean anything." "Sir, with respect, the chatter isn't vague. Multiple sources confirm." "I said we're not changing the plan." His voice had gone hard, the tone that meant the discussion was over. "That's an order, Captain Wells." I felt the eyes of the other officers on me, felt the weight of that moment standing between my duty as a daughter and my duty as a soldier. In the military, you follow orders. Chain of command isn't a suggestion. Disobeying a direct order in a combat zone could end your career, could result in court-martial. But 12 lives hung in the balance. The convoy rolled out at dawn. I was in the third vehicle, watching the landscape pass, my stomach tight with dread. My father led from the front Humvee, confident and commanding the way he'd always been. I kept thinking about the intelligence reports, kept seeing the patterns that screamed trap. 2 miles from the extraction point, I made my decision. I radioed my driver, Sergeant Rodriguez, and told him to take the alternate road I'd mapped. When the convoy started to split, my father's voice came over the radio, sharp with anger. "Captain Wells, what the hell are you doing? Get back in formation." "Sir, I have new intelligence. Taking alternate route to avoid potential ambush. That's a direct violation of orders. Return to the planned route immediately." I switched off my radio. Rodriguez looked at me with wide eyes, understanding what I was doing, what it would cost. But he followed my orders because he trusted my judgment more than he trusted protocol. The 3 vehicles in my section took the longer route through the mountain pass. It added 30 minutes to our time. And when we arrived at the extraction point from the opposite direction, we found exactly what I'd feared, a Taliban ambush position set up along the main route, fighters waiting with RPGs and machine guns. They'd been so focused on the expected approach that we caught them completely off guard. We secured Sparrow and engaged the ambush position from behind, neutralizing the threat. No American casualties. The informant was saved. Mission successful. But success didn't matter to my father. What mattered was that I'd disobeyed him, that I'd been right when he was wrong, that his daughter had undermined his authority in front of his men. The after-action report was required protocol. I documented everything: the intelligence that predicted the ambush, the decision to alter the route, the confirmation of enemy positions that proved the main route would have driven us into a kill zone. I was factual, clinical. I never said my father was wrong. I just reported what happened. But the report went up the chain of command and questions were asked. Why had the commanding officer ignored credible intelligence? Why had a junior officer felt compelled to disobey direct orders? An investigation was opened. Other instances of my father's poor judgment came to light. Risks he'd taken that had worked out through luck rather than planning intelligence he'd dismissed, warnings he'd ignored. The board of inquiry was quiet and efficient. They interviewed everyone involved. Rodriguez and the other men testified that I'd saved their lives. The Taliban fighters captured in the engagement confirmed they'd been waiting along the main route expecting us. My father was found negligent. Not criminal, not malicious, just negligent. Poor command judgment. Failure to properly utilize available intelligence. It was enough. He was formally reprimanded, passed over for promotion, and encouraged to accept early retirement. His career was effectively over. He came to my quarters the night after the board's decision. I'd expected anger, maybe even understood it. What I hadn't expected was the cold, calculated hatred in his eyes. "You destroyed me," he said quietly. "Your own father. You couldn't stand that I was in command, that you had to follow my orders. So you found a way to take me down." "I saved 12 lives," I said, my voice shaking. "I did my job." "You betrayed me, and I will make sure you pay for it. Every day for the rest of your life, I will make sure you remember what you did." And he kept his promise to make me pay. The morning after the disastrous dinner, my mother informed me that Victoria had organized a bridal brunch at the country club. It was, she said carefully, an opportunity for the women of both families to get to know each other better. The way she said it made clear this wasn't optional. Victoria's family expected certain traditions to be observed, and my presence was required to avoid seeming deliberately rude. I arrived at the Piedmont Country Club at 11, driving past the manicured golf course and perfectly trimmed hedges that screamed exclusivity. The building itself was all white columns and brick designed to evoke plantation elegance while carefully avoiding any actual historical reference. I'd been here once before years ago when my father still had his membership before his discharge, made the annual fees feel like a reminder of everything he'd lost. The hostess directed me to a private dining room where 20 women sat around tables draped in ivory linens. Victoria held court at the center, radiant in a pale pink dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her mother Linda sat beside her, and I recognized several aunts and cousins from dinner. My mother was there too, looking anxious and out of place despite her best dress and freshly styled hair. Victoria spotted me and waved me over with the kind of enthusiasm that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Erica, we're so glad you could make it. Come sit with us." She gestured to an empty chair at her table positioned between her mother and an aunt whose name I'd already forgotten. I sat down, acutely aware of how different I looked from these women. They wore pastels and florals, delicate jewelry makeup applied with the skill that came from having time and money to perfect it. I'd chosen a simple gray dress and minimal jewelry, my hair pulled back in the same practical style I wore to work. "We were just talking about wedding preparations," Victoria said brightly, pouring me a mimosa I hadn't asked for. "It's been absolutely exhausting, but so worth it. Mother has been incredible helping coordinate everything." Linda Hartwell smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd orchestrated many successful social events. "It's important to do these things properly," she said, her voice carrying the authority of old money and older traditions. "A wedding sets the tone for a marriage after all. It's about bringing families together, establishing connections." One of Victoria's aunts, a woman in her 60s, wearing enough pearls to stock a jewelry store, leaned forward with an expression of polite curiosity. "Erica, dear Victoria tells us you're in the military. How unusual for a young woman. What made you choose that path?" The question sounded innocent enough, but I heard the judgment underneath. Young woman, as if I were still 20 instead of 38. That path, as if I'd wandered off the acceptable route. "I wanted to serve," I said simply. "Of course, service is admirable," Linda said in the tone people use when they're about to contradict themselves. "But it must be so difficult. All that structure and, well, violence. Not really suited to a woman's nature, is it? We're meant to nurture, to create homes and families." Victoria touched my arm with false sympathy. "It must be so hard being away from family, missing all the important moments. Weddings, births, holidays. I can't imagine choosing that kind of loneliness." Chose violence over family. The accusation hung unspoken but clear. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat across the table. I saw her mouth open slightly, perhaps wanting to defend me, but years of keeping peace had trained her to silence. Another aunt chimed in. "And the hierarchy must be challenging for you, dear. Taking orders from men, always having to be so aggressive and competitive. It changes women, doesn't it? Makes them harder." "I imagine it's difficult to maintain femininity in that environment," Victoria said, her voice dripping with concern that felt more like criticism. "All those men, all that posturing. You must love giving orders even here at family events." The implication landed like a slap. Too aggressive, too masculine, too much. The other women nodded with sympathetic expressions, as if I were a problem to be diagnosed, a cautionary tale about what happened when women forgot their place. I took a sip of the mimosa. I didn't want buying myself a moment. I could feel them waiting for me to either defend myself desperately or shrink apologetically. Either response would confirm what they already believed about me. Instead, I set down my glass and met Victoria's eyes directly. "Only when no one else takes responsibility." The words came out calm, almost conversational, but they carried weight that stopped the chatter around the table. Victoria's practiced smile flickered uncertainty crossing her face. She'd expected defensiveness or embarrassment, not quiet certainty. "I'm sure Erica has had to make difficult decisions," my mother said quickly, trying to smooth over the tension she could feel building. But Linda wasn't ready to let it go. Well, of course, decisions are necessary in any job, but there's a difference between civilian work and, well, what you do. Normal careers don't require that level of aggression. Women in business and education, in proper professions, they succeed through collaboration and grace, not force. Is that what you think the military is? I asked, keeping my voice even. Just force and aggression. The aunt with the pearls laughed lightly. What else would you call it, dear? Surely you're not claiming that pushing papers in some office building requires real skill. Administrative work is administrative work, whether you're wearing a uniform or business attire. There it was again. The assumption that I filed paperwork, that my service was decorative rather than essential, that 20 years of my life amounted to nothing more than stamping forms and answering phones. Victoria leaned back in her chair, her confidence returning. I think what we're all saying, Erica, is that it's just so sad. You've missed out on so much of what makes life meaningful. Marriage, children, building a real home. Career is fine, but it's not everything. Sometimes I look at women like you and just feel grateful I chose differently. She said it with such sweetness, such apparent sincerity, that it took a moment for the cruelty to fully register. Women like you. The category of the pitiable, the women who'd made wrong choices and ended up alone. The table had gone quiet, waiting to see how I'd respond to this verdict on my life. My mother looked like she might cry. Victoria's relatives exchanged glances that mixed satisfaction with curiosity. I could have told them the truth, could have explained exactly what kind of decisions I made, what responsibilities I carried, what my administrative work actually meant for national security. Could have defended myself with the weight of achievements they couldn't begin to understand. But I realized something in that moment. These women didn't want truth. They wanted confirmation of their own choices, validation that their traditional paths were superior. My success threatened that narrative, so they had to dismiss it, diminish it, make it smaller than what they'd chosen. And I was tired of making myself smaller for people's comfort. You're right, I said quietly, standing up from the table. I chose differently, and I'm grateful for that choice every single day. The bride laughed, a light tinkling sound meant to signal that she'd won this exchange. I didn't. I left the bridal brunch early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely fabricated. The country club's suffocating politeness and thinly veiled contempt had given me a genuine throb behind my temples. I drove back to the house, intending to collect my things and find a hotel for the remaining days before the wedding. Staying under my father's roof was becoming unbearable. But as I pulled up to the house, I noticed Nathan's BMW still in the driveway alongside my father's sedan. They should have been at the country club for the men's golf outing that was happening simultaneously with the brunch. I parked and approached the house quietly, some instinct making me cautious. The front door was unlocked, and I could hear voices coming from my father's study. The door was slightly ajar, and I recognized both my father's voice and Nathan's speaking in tones that suggested serious business rather than casual conversation. I should have announced myself, should have walked away. But something in their tone made me pause in the hallway. The contract with Dalton Defense would change everything, my father was saying, and I heard the hunger in his voice. It's not just about the money, Nathan. It's about redemption. Do you understand that Marcus Dalton is one of the most respected names in military contracting? If we can get him to partner with your company, it validates us. It proves that what happened in Afghanistan was just politics, not incompetence. I understand, Dad, Nathan replied, sounding tired. But I'm not sure using my wedding as a business pitch is the best approach. Victoria's already stressed about. Victoria's family has money but no real power, my father interrupted. Dalton has both. He's bringing Pentagon connections, government contracts, legitimacy. This wedding is the perfect opportunity. 300 guests, multiple politicians, local business leaders. When Dalton sees the kind of event we can orchestrate, the kind of family we are, he'll understand we're serious players. I pressed myself against the hallway wall, my heart beating faster. Marcus Dalton. They were talking about Marcus Dalton. You've prepared the presentation, my father asked. Yes, Nathan said. Development projections for the new subdivision, potential DoD housing contracts, infrastructure proposals. I've got everything ready. But Dad, what if he's not interested? What if... He'll be interested, my father said with absolute conviction. I've done my research. Dalton Defense is expanding into real estate development near military installations. Your company is perfectly positioned for that market. All we need is FaceTime with him, a chance to make our case. The wedding gives us that. Does he even know he's being pitched? Nathan asked. I thought Victoria's father invited him as a courtesy because they serve on some board together. Dalton doesn't need to know it's a pitch, my father said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. That's the beauty of it. We network naturally, show him what Nathan Wells' development can do, plant the seeds. By the time he realizes we're courting his business, he'll already be impressed. There was a pause and I heard papers rustling. What about Erica? Nathan asked quietly. The question hung in the air. I held my breath. What about her? My father said, his voice hardening. She's military, high-ranking apparently based on what that officer said at the rehearsal. What if she knows Dalton? What if she says something that... Erica is a mid-level analyst who's spent her career behind a desk, my father said dismissively. She doesn't move in Dalton's circles. Men like him command operations, make strategic decisions. They don't interact with paper pushers. And even if by some miracle she's encountered him in passing, what's she going to say? That her father wants to do business with him? That's not a crime, Nathan. I just think we should be careful, Nathan said. She's been quiet since she got here, but you know how she can be. If she thinks we're using the wedding for business, then she can think whatever she wants, my father said sharply. This is about securing your future, Nathan. About building something that lasts. Erica made her choices and they've led nowhere. You've made better ones. Let her sit in the back and watch what real success looks like. I heard footsteps approaching the door and quickly moved down the hallway, slipping into the kitchen as if I'd just arrived. My hands were shaking. Not from fear or anger, but from the absurdity of it all. They were planning to court Marcus Dalton at the wedding, using Nathan's business and the event's grandeur to impress a man they didn't actually know. A man who was, in fact, my direct superior and had been my mentor for the past 6 years. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a message from an unfamiliar number, but I recognized the Pentagon routing code. It was from Colonel Patricia Morrison, who handled coordination between military leadership and civilian events. The message was brief. General Dalton will be attending the wedding. He's asked about you. Observe quietly. Don't intervene yet. I read it twice, my mind racing. Dalton had asked about me. He knew I'd be there, which meant he probably knew about the Wells family connection, about my father's history. Marcus Dalton didn't do anything without careful consideration. If he was coming to this wedding, it wasn't just because Thomas Hartwell had invited him to a social event. I typed back a single word, understood. My father and Nathan emerged from the study, both looking pleased with themselves. They spotted me in the kitchen, and their expressions shifted to guarded neutrality. Erica, my father said. I thought you'd be at the brunch longer. It ended early, I said, keeping my voice even. I came back to rest before tonight's rehearsal dinner. Nathan looked uncomfortable, probably wondering if I'd overheard anything. My father just nodded, already dismissing me from his thoughts as he turned back to Nathan. Remember Saturday night at the reception? That's when we make our move. Confident, professional, casual, like we're doing him a favor by bringing him this opportunity. I watched them walk away, already deep in conversation about their plans, their strategies, their certain path to redemption through a business deal they assumed would be easy to secure. They had no idea what was actually coming. I thought about texting Morrison back, asking for more details about Dalton's intentions. But I already knew. Marcus Dalton was a man who valued loyalty, integrity, and competence above all else. He'd spent 30 years in the military, building a reputation for seeing through facades and rewarding genuine merit. My father thought he could impress Dalton with a fancy wedding and a polished presentation. He was about to learn how badly he'd miscalculated. but family wars rarely stay quiet. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling with its familiar water stain that looked like a map of some country I'd never visited. The house was quiet, except for the occasional creak of old wood, settling sounds I'd memorized during countless sleepless nights as a teenager. I'd been drifting toward sleep when I heard the soft knock on my door so gentle I almost missed it. "Erica." My mother's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you awake?" I sat up and turned on the bedside lamp. "Come in, Mom." The door opened slowly, and my mother slipped inside wearing a faded bathrobe I recognized from my high school years. She looked smaller than she had at dinner, more fragile, as if she'd shed some protective layer along with her daytime clothes. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, streaked with gray. I hadn't noticed before, and her face was bare of makeup, showing every line that worry had carved into her features. She closed the door behind her and stood there uncertainly, her hands clasped in front of her like a penitent. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I kept thinking about tomorrow, about the wedding, about everything that could go wrong." "Sit down, Mom." I patted the edge of the bed, and she crossed the room to perch beside me, her movements careful and quiet, as if she were afraid of disturbing something. For a moment, we sat in silence. I could smell the lavender lotion she'd used for as long as I could remember, a scent that still meant comfort, despite everything. She twisted her hands in her lap, and I noticed the tremor in her fingers. "I need to ask you something," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, Erica. Please don't embarrass your father during Nathan's special moment. I know things have been difficult between you two. I know he's said things that hurt you, but this wedding is so important to him. To all of us." The words settled over me like a familiar weight. How many times had I heard variations of this plea? Please don't make waves. Please keep quiet. Please let it go. My mother had spent my entire life asking me to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating, as if my very existence required constant apology. "I'm not planning to cause any problems, Mom," I said, keeping my voice gentle despite the frustration rising in my chest. "I know you're not planning to," she said quickly. "But sometimes you don't realize how you come across. You can be so intense, so serious. People don't always understand that about you. Your father especially. He sees defiance even when you don't mean it that way." She reached out and touched my arm, and that's when I saw them clearly for the first time. Faint white scars scattered across her wrists, some old and faded, others more recent. They weren't the deep, purposeful cuts of someone trying to end their life. They were smaller, irregular, the marks of someone who picked at their own skin when anxiety became unbearable. Years of nervous habit had left a permanent record on her flesh. I stared at those scars and felt something crack open in my chest. My mother had absorbed so much tension, so much unspoken anger and disappointment, that it had literally marked her body. She'd spent decades standing between my father's rage and everyone else, taking the impact herself, wearing herself down to almost nothing in the process. "Mom," I said softly, covering her hand with mine. "When did this start?" She pulled her hand back quickly, tugging the sleeves of her robe down to hide her wrists. "It's nothing. Just a nervous habit. Everyone has their ways of coping with stress." But we both knew it wasn't nothing. It was everything she couldn't say. Everything she'd swallowed to keep the peace manifesting in the only way her body knew how. "Your father has been under so much pressure." She continued, her voice taking on the practiced tone of someone who'd repeated these explanations countless times. "Losing his career, watching Nathan build success while feeling like he failed. It's made him hard sometimes, I know that. But he's not cruel, Erica. He's just broken. Broken people lash out. They can't help it." There it was, the familiar refrain. He's not cruel, just broken. As if brokenness excused everything. As if being damaged gave someone permission to damage others. My mother had spent so long making excuses for him that she'd convinced herself abuse was just another word for pain, that cruelty was just brokenness showing its face. "Broken people still hurt others, Mom," I said quietly. Being broken doesn't make it okay. She shook her head, tears gathering in her eyes. You don't understand what it's been like for him. The humiliation, the shame. Men like your father need to feel important, need to feel respected. When that's taken away, they struggle. I've tried to hold things together to make it easier for everyone, but it's been so hard. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't her job to hold everything together, that she'd sacrificed herself for a man who'd never appreciated it, who'd used her as a shield against his own failures, that her children had watched her disappear piece by piece into the role of peacekeeper, and it had taught us terrible lessons about what love was supposed to look like. But looking at her exhausted face, her anxious eyes, her trembling hands, I couldn't add to her burden. A cough rose in my throat, sudden and sharp. I turned away to cover it, feeling the scratchiness that had been bothering me for weeks now. The exhaustion that seemed to settle deeper into my bones each day. I'd been attributing it to stress, to the emotional toll of being back in this house, but in that moment, I wondered if it was something more. You're sick, my mother said, her maternal instincts surfacing through the worry. Have you seen a doctor? It's just stress, I said, clearing my throat. I'll be fine once I get back to work. She looked at me with such sadness, as if she could see something I couldn't. You're always fine, aren't you? Always strong. Always handling everything on your own. But Erica, everyone needs help sometimes. Everyone needs someone to take care of them. The irony of hearing that from her, a woman who'd needed help for decades and never asked for it, was almost too much. I know, Mom, I said, even though we both understood I'd never learned how to ask. She stood up slowly as if the conversation had physically drained her. At the door, she turned back one more time. Just get through this weekend, please. For me, if not for your father. Let Nathan have his moment. Then you can go back to your life, and we can all breathe again. After she left, I lay back down and stared at the ceiling again. The house creaked around me, full of secrets and suffering that everyone pretended not to see. My mother's scars, my father's rage, Nathan's careful performance, and me, the daughter who'd learned that survival sometimes meant silence. Broken people still cut the deepest. The wedding rehearsal was scheduled for Friday evening at the Piedmont Country Club, giving everyone one final run-through before the ceremony the next day. I arrived early as requested, wearing simple black pants and a white blouse that seemed appropriate for an event that fell somewhere between formal and casual. My mother had texted me 3 times that morning with reminders to be on time, to smile, to please just help things run smoothly. When I walked into the main ballroom, the space had been transformed. White chairs lined up in perfect rows, a flower-draped arch positioned at the front tables, arranged with geometric precision for the reception that would follow the ceremony. Wedding coordinators moved through the space with clipboards adjusting details that already looked perfect to my untrained eye. My father stood near the entrance in conversation with Thomas Hartwell, both men holding glasses of what looked like scotch despite the early hour. Nathan was across the room with Victoria reviewing something on her phone, both of them dressed as if they were already attending the actual wedding, rather than just practicing for it. I approached my father to ask where he wanted me to sit during the rehearsal, and he barely glanced at me before gesturing vaguely toward the parking lot. "The valet service is running behind," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Someone needs to direct guests to the overflow parking. You're good at following directions. Handle it." I felt the words land like a slap, but I kept my expression neutral. "You want me to direct parking? Is that a problem?" His voice carried an edge of challenge. "We're all pitching in to make this day perfect for Nathan and Victoria, unless you think you're above helping your own family." Thomas Hartwell looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight and suddenly finding his drink very interesting. Across the room, Nathan had looked up at the sound of my father's raised voice, but he made no move to intervene. "No problem," I said quietly. "I'll take care of it." I walked back outside into the September evening heat, positioning myself near the entrance to the parking area. For the next hour, I directed arriving guests to available spaces, answered questions about where to find the bathroom, and helped an elderly aunt navigate the curb in her high heels. Cars arrived steadily. Nathan's groomsmen in their expensive sports cars, Victoria's bridesmaids in gleaming SUVs, various relatives and friends all dressed in cocktail attire for what was essentially a practice run. Nathan's groomsmen noticed me standing there and seemed to find it amusing. I heard one of them, a man named Brad, who I'd met briefly at dinner, call out loudly to his friends as they walked past. "Hey, looks like the Wells family put their military daughter on parking duty. Guess that discipline training comes in handy for party planning, right?" His friends laughed, and I saw him mime a salute in my direction, mocking and exaggerated. Another one chimed in, "Think she'll stand guard at the gift table too. Make sure nobody steals the blenders." More laughter. They weren't trying to be quiet about it. They wanted me to hear, wanted to establish the pecking order of this social event. I was staff, not family. Help, not guest. I said nothing, just continued directing traffic with the same efficiency I brought to every task. But inside, something was hardening. Each car that passed, each dismissive glance, each assumption that I was there to serve rather than celebrate, added weight to a growing resolve. If they wanted to treat me as invisible, I'd let them. For now. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, when a dark sedan pulled into the lot. It was understated compared to the luxury vehicles around it, and I noticed immediately that the driver wore a military dress uniform. My instinct was to look away to avoid any connection between my civilian presence here and my military life, but the car was headed toward an open space I needed to direct. The driver parked and stepped out, and I recognized him immediately. Captain James Chen, a young officer I'd worked with on an intelligence assessment 6 months ago. Brilliant analyst, impeccable service. Record the kind of soldier who made you believe the military was in good hands. He was adjusting his uniform jacket when he looked up and saw me standing there in the parking lot. For a split second, confusion crossed his face, as if he couldn't quite reconcile seeing me in this context. Then training took over, and his entire posture changed. He snapped to attention, his arm rising in a crisp salute, his voice carrying clearly across the parking area. "Good evening, Colonel Wells. Ma'am, I didn't expect to see you here." The words seemed to echo in the sudden quiet. I was dimly aware that conversations had stopped, that people who'd been walking toward the building had frozen mid-step, that heads were turning toward us. I returned the salute, automatically, muscle memory from 20 years of service, overriding my desire to avoid this exact situation. "At ease, Captain. Are you a guest?" "Yes, ma'am. My sister is one of Victoria's bridesmaids. I apologize, I didn't mean to." He stopped, finally registering the expressions of the people around us, the weight of what he'd just revealed. His eyes widened slightly as understanding dawned. "I should go inside. Excuse me, ma'am." He walked quickly toward the building, leaving me standing alone in the parking lot with what felt like 100 pairs of eyes suddenly trained on me. Brad and his friends had stopped mid-conversation, their mocking expressions replaced by confusion. One of them said, "Did he just call her Colonel?" But no one answered him. Near the entrance, I could see my father standing perfectly still, his face drained of color. He'd been in the military long enough to understand what that salute meant, what that form of address signified. Nathan stood beside him, mouth slightly open, looking between me and the doorway where Captain Chen had disappeared. Victoria's mother had emerged from the building, drawn by the commotion, and she looked utterly baffled. She turned to my father with a question forming on her lips, but he seemed incapable of speech. Other guests who'd witnessed the exchange began whispering to each other, the sound building like wind before a storm. I caught fragments of their confusion. "Colonel, I thought she worked admin." "Richard said she was just a desk job." "Why would an officer salute her like that?" My mother appeared at the entrance, her hand pressed to her chest, her face pale. She looked at me with something between pride and terror, knowing that the careful fiction my father had constructed was beginning to crumble. Nathan recovered first plastering on a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that was unexpected. Erica, maybe you should come inside now. I think we're about to start the rehearsal." His voice was too loud, too bright, trying to move past the moment as if it hadn't happened. but I could see in his expression that he understood this was significant, that something had shifted in a way he couldn't control. I walked toward the building, passing the groomsmen, who now avoided my eyes, passing Victoria's family members, who studied me with new interest, passing my father, who still hadn't moved or spoken. As I entered the cool, air-conditioned space of the country club, I heard the whispers intensify behind me. Questions being asked, my father fumbling for explanations, Nathan trying to smooth things over with charm and deflection. The first domino had fallen. Saturday dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect September day that made people believe in signs from the universe. I woke early in my hotel room, having finally left my parents' house the night before with a polite excuse about giving the family space before the big day. The truth was, I couldn't spend another night under that roof watching my mother's anxious face and avoiding my father's cold glares after the incident with Captain Chen. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple slate blue dress that was elegant without being attention-seeking. My hair was pulled back in a low twist, minimal jewelry, low heels that would let me stand for hours without discomfort. I looked exactly like what I was supposed to be, the dutiful sister present, but peripheral support staff for someone else's starring role. The Piedmont Country Club had been completely transformed overnight. As I pulled into the lot at noon, 3 hours before the ceremony, I could see the small army of vendors still working. A massive white tent covered the garden area where the reception would be held. Floral arrangements that must have cost thousands lined the walkways. A red carpet ran from the parking area to the entrance, and I noticed a local news van setting up near the front steps. Of course, there would be press coverage. My father had made sure of that. This wasn't just a wedding, it was his public resurrection, his proof to Millbrook. And beyond that, the Wells family name still meant something. Inside, the main ballroom had been converted into something from a magazine spread. 300 white chairs with ivory ribbon bows faced an elaborate floral arch dripping with roses and orchids. Crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. A string quartet was setting up in the corner, their instruments gleaming. Everything was pristine, perfect, expensive. My mother found me immediately looking elegant in a champagne-colored dress, but with that familiar tension around her eyes. "You're here," she said, relief flooding her voice. "I was worried you might not come after last night." "I said I'd be here, Mom." She squeezed my hand briefly. "You're sitting in the back on the left side. Your father thought it would be best given how many important guests we have in the front rows." She said it apologetically, as if she hadn't participated in the decision to physically distance me from the family. I found my assigned seat in the second-to-last row, tucked against the side aisle. Around me, the chairs remained empty. This section was clearly for overflow guests, people who'd been invited out of obligation rather than genuine desire for their presence. From here, I had a clear view of the entire room, but remained essentially invisible to anyone looking toward the front. Guests began arriving in waves. I watched them flow past me like a river around a stone, barely registering my presence as they sought out their assigned seats. I recognized faces from dinner, from the brunch, from years of family gatherings where I'd been tolerated rather than welcomed. They wore their finest clothes, and practiced smiles came bearing expensive gifts wrapped in silver and white, ready to witness and celebrate the union that would merge two prominent families. My father stationed himself near the entrance, playing host with the kind of enthusiasm I'd rarely seen from him. He shook hands vigorously, clapped men on the shoulders, kissed women's cheeks. I watched him introduce Nathan to various guests, business leaders, local politicians, retired military officers who'd somehow remained in his network despite his disgrace. Nathan played his part well, confident and charming, the successful son who'd made his father proud. When someone asked Richard about his daughter, which happened occasionally as people noticed me sitting alone in the back, he waved vaguely in my direction and said something dismissive. I couldn't hear the exact words from this distance, but I'd heard variations before. "She works for the government, administrative position, never married, bit of a career woman." Then he'd quickly redirect the conversation to Nathan's accomplishments, or the beauty of the venue, or anything that moved attention away from the daughter who represented his failure. Thomas Hartwell arrived with his wife Linda, and a small entourage of their wealthy friends. And I watched my father's demeanor shift to something more deferential. These were the people he needed to impress the connections that would validate his family's return to respectability. He guided them to their premium seats in the second row right behind where immediate family would sit. The string quartet began playing soft classical music as more guests filled the seats. I recognized several faces from local television: the mayor, a state congressman, the owner of the region's largest car dealership. My father had called in every favor extended, every invitation to ensure this wedding would be witnessed by people who mattered. Victoria's bridesmaids arrived in succession, each wearing dusty rose gowns that probably cost more than my monthly rent. They giggled and posed for photographs, performing the role of supportive friends for the cameras. Nathan's groomsmen assembled near the front, Brad among them, looking considerably more sober than he had the night before. Then I saw him. Marcus Dalton entered the ballroom with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent decades commanding respect without demanding it. He wore a dark suit rather than his uniform, but his military bearing was unmistakable: the straight posture, the steady gaze, the economy of movement that came from years of discipline. He was in his early 60s, gray-haired and distinguished, with the kind of face that had seen combat and boardrooms and knew the difference between the two. My father spotted him immediately and moved to intercept hand-extended smile stretching wider than I'd seen all day. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I sat, but I could read my father's body language: eager, ingratiating, working hard to make an impression. Dalton shook his hand politely, but without enthusiasm, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent a career evaluating situations and people. For just a moment, his gaze swept past where I sat. I thought I saw a flicker of recognition. But then, he was turning back to my father, nodding at something being said, allowing himself to be guided toward a seat in the third row, close enough to be honored, far enough to maintain professional distance. Nathan appeared at my father's elbow, and I watched the introduction happen. My brother's rehearsed confidence, his practiced handshake, his carefully prepared small talk. Dalton responded with the polite interest of someone who'd sat through countless such interactions, pleasant but non-committal. The ceremony began precisely at 3 o'clock. The quartet shifted to Wagner, and everyone stood as Victoria began her processional down the aisle on her father's arm. She looked beautiful. I had to admit her dress was stunning, her smile radiant, her timing perfect. Thomas Hartwell walked with the satisfied expression of a man who'd successfully arranged an advantageous match. Nathan stood at the altar looking genuinely moved, and for a moment I saw the little brother I'd once protected on playgrounds and helped with homework. Then my father's profile came into view from where he sat in the front row, and I remembered that this ceremony wasn't really about Nathan and Victoria's love. It was about redemption, validation, and the erasure of shame through social performance. The officiant spoke about love and commitment and partnership. The couple exchanged vows they'd written themselves, full of promises about adventure and support and growing old together. Victoria's voice trembled with emotion. Nathan's eyes glistened with tears. It was touching and genuine, and also somehow completely hollow, because I knew what was happening beneath the surface. The business machinations, the social climbing, the desperate need for this day to rewrite my father's narrative. I watched it all from my back row seat, invisible to everyone except the occasional guest who walked past to use the restroom and looked mildly surprised to find someone sitting in this section. The ceremony was flawless. The kiss was perfectly timed for the cameras. The music swelled at exactly the right moment. Everyone applauded as the new couple walked back down the aisle, beaming and victorious. As guests began filing out toward the garden for cocktails before the reception, I remained seated for a moment, letting the crowd flow around me. I watched my father walk past with a group of business associates holding forth about the beauty of the ceremony, already networking. I watched Nathan and Victoria pose for what must have been the 100th photograph. I watched Victoria's family accept congratulations with the graciousness of people accustomed to being celebrated. They thought I was furniture. I was a fuse. The reception unfolded under the massive white tent in the country club's garden, transformed into something between a fairy tale and a corporate gala. Tiny white lights were strung overhead, creating an artificial starfield against the fabric ceiling. Round tables draped in ivory linens held centerpieces of roses and hydrangeas that must have required a team of florists working through the night. A full bar occupied one corner, staffed by 3 bartenders working to keep up with the demand. A dance floor gleamed in the center, currently empty but waiting for the traditional first dances. I found my assigned table near the back, naturally alongside relatives I barely knew, and friends of the family who seemed equally unclear about why they'd been seated together. The woman next to me, someone's great-aunt, asked politely what I did for a living, and when I said I worked for the Department of Defense, she nodded vaguely and turned to her husband to discuss the floral arrangements. Dinner was served in courses, each one more elaborate than the last. Servers in crisp uniforms moved through the space with practiced efficiency, delivering plates that looked like artwork microgreens arranged just so, sauces drizzled in perfect circles, portions sized for people who valued presentation over sustenance. The wine flowed freely, glasses refilled before they reached halfway empty. I watched my father work the room between courses. He moved from table to table, drink in hand, spending extra time with the guests who mattered most. I saw him linger at Dalton's table, leaning in to say something that made the general nod politely. I saw him laughing too loudly, with the congressman touching his shoulder with the false intimacy of someone desperate to seem connected. Nathan followed in his wake like an apprentice learning the art of networking, Victoria beside him, in her beautiful dress playing her role perfectly. By the time dessert arrived, individual wedding cakes decorated with edible flowers my father had consumed. At least 4 glasses of wine that I'd counted, probably more that I'd missed. His face was flushed, his movements looser, his voice carrying more than it had earlier. My mother watched him with barely concealed anxiety, her own dessert untouched on her plate. The DJ announced that the father of the groom would now give a toast, and the room settled into that expectant quiet that accompanies such moments. My father stood slightly unsteady and took the microphone that was offered to him. Someone adjusted a spotlight so it caught him perfectly, and I saw the local news camera swing in his direction. He tapped the microphone twice, the sound echoing through the tent, and smiled broadly at the assembled guests. "Friends, family, honored guests." He began his words only slightly slurred. "What a perfect day this has been. What a perfect day to celebrate my son Nathan and his beautiful bride Victoria." Applause rippled through the crowd. Nathan smiled tightly. Victoria beamed. "You know, people ask me what I'm most proud of as a father." My father continued, warming to his audience. "And I tell them I'm proud that I raised a son who understands what real success looks like." Nathan didn't waste his time chasing glory or medals or the approval of people who don't matter. He built something concrete, something that lasts, an empire. He gestured toward Nathan with his wine glass sloshing slightly. "My boy understood that the real battlefield isn't in some desert or jungle. It's right here in the boardroom, in the marketplace, in the places where fortunes are made and legacies are built. He knew when to focus his talents where they'd actually count." The implication hung heavy in the air. I felt heads turning subtly in my direction, people making the connection, understanding who he was really talking about. "Nathan chose the path of wisdom," my father said, his voice growing louder. "He found himself a proper wife from a good family. He built a business that makes a real difference in people's lives. He made his father proud." He paused for effect, taking another sip of wine. The pause stretched a beat too long, and I knew what was coming. I'd known it since I'd decided to attend this wedding. Maybe I'd known it my entire life. "And of course," my father said, turning his body slightly so the spotlight caught his profile, "I can't give a toast without mentioning my daughter, Erica. Our desk soldier." The laughter started immediately, rippling through the crowd like a wave. I saw Victoria's mother cover her smile with her hand. I saw Brad and the other groomsmen openly grinning. I saw the congressman exchange a knowing look with his wife. She may not have built an empire like Nathan, my father continued, riding the laughter. She may not have given me grandchildren or married into a prominent family, but I'm sure she files papers very efficiently somewhere in Washington. To each their own path, right? Some people build legacies and some people push papers. The camera from the local news station was recording every word. The laughter grew louder. My father raised his glass higher, basking in the attention in the validation of the crowd's response. This was his moment of triumph, publicly diminishing his disappointing daughter, while celebrating his successful son, all in front of the people whose opinions he valued most. Nathan's face had gone pale. He wasn't laughing, but he wasn't stopping it either. He just stood there, frozen between his father's expectations and whatever conscience he might still possess. My mother had her hand pressed to her mouth, tears visible in her eyes even from this distance. And Marcus Dalton sat perfectly still at his table, his expression unreadable, watching the scene unfold with the careful attention of someone gathering intelligence. I felt every eye in the tent turn toward me, waiting to see how I would react. Would I cry? Would I leave? Would I make a scene that would give them even more to talk about? Instead, I stood slowly, deliberately. I picked up my wine glass with a steady hand. The laughter died down as people realized I was responding, curiosity replacing their mockery. I looked directly at my father, meeting his eyes across the crowded tent. Then I spoke, my voice clear and calm, carrying without needing to shout. To those who sit behind desks, I said, letting each word land with precision, so others can stand on solid ground. I raised my glass higher and took a deliberate sip. The toast sounded gracious on the surface, supportive even, but several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing something beneath the words that they couldn't quite identify. A challenge, perhaps, or a promise. My father's smile widened, taking my words as capitulation, as proof that I'd accepted my place in his narrative. He raised his own glass triumphantly, and the crowd, uncertain but following his lead, applauded. I sat back down, my expression neutral, my posture relaxed. Let them think I was defeated. Let them believe they'd won. Let my father bask in his perceived victory for just a few more minutes, because I'd seen something he hadn't noticed in his wine-fueled confidence. I'd seen Marcus Dalton set down his glass and check his watch. I'd seen him signal something to the aide sitting beside him, a young lieutenant I hadn't noticed before. And now, as my father launched into more self-congratulatory rambling, as the DJ prepared to restart the music, as the party seemed ready to move past this ugly moment, I heard it. The sound of vehicles pulling up outside the tent. Multiple vehicles. Engines that sounded official, purposeful. Then came the convoy. The music stopped mid-song. Conversations died mid-sentence. 300 heads turned toward the entrance of the tent as the unmistakable sound of heavy vehicles drew closer. Through the open sides of the pavilion, I could see 3 black SUVs pulling up to the country club entrance in perfect formation, the kind of precision that spoke of military training and serious purpose. My father, still holding the microphone, squinted toward the vehicles with confused irritation. This wasn't planned. Nothing happened at this wedding that wasn't planned. He handed the microphone back to the DJ and straightened his jacket, trying to regain control of his carefully orchestrated event. "Must be additional security," he said to Thomas Hartwell, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "The congressman probably requested extra protection. You know how these politicians are." But I knew better. I'd seen that configuration of vehicles before, had ridden in convoys just like it. These weren't local security or political protection. These were Pentagon motor pool vehicles, the kind reserved for high-ranking military officials and matters of national importance. The first SUV's doors opened, and 2 men in dark suits stepped out clearly, security scanning the area with practiced efficiency. Then the rear door of the second vehicle opened, and Marcus Dalton emerged. He wore his full dress uniform, something he rarely did in civilian settings. The dark blue fabric was immaculate, every crease, sharp, every button polished. But it was the insignia that made several guests gasp audibly, 4 stars on his shoulder boards catching the afternoon light. Ribbons covered his chest in neat rows, each one representing commendations campaigns, years of distinguished service. This wasn't Marcus Dalton, the CEO, making a social appearance. This was 4-star General Marcus Dalton, retired, announcing through his very presence that something significant was happening. He stood for a moment surveying the scene with the calm assessment of someone who'd commanded thousands of troops in combat zones and boardrooms alike. His aide, a young lieutenant I now recognized as part of his personal staff, moved to his side and said something quietly. Dalton nodded once. My father had already started moving toward the entrance, his earlier confidence returning as he assumed this display was somehow connected to his invitation, his networking, his carefully cultivated connections. He plastered on his most ingratiating smile and extended his hand. General Dalton, what an honor. I'm Richard Wells, Nathan's father. We spoke earlier. I'm so glad you could make it to the ceremony. This entrance is quite something. Very impressive. Dalton shook his hand briefly professionally, but without warmth. Mr. Wells, he said simply. Then his eyes moved past my father, scanning the crowd. Richard tried to maintain his grip on the interaction. I wanted to talk with you about some exciting opportunities in the defense contracting space. My son Nathan has built a remarkable real estate company, and we think there could be some synergies with... But Dalton was no longer listening. His gaze had found me sitting at my table in the back, and I saw the shift in his expression from formal politeness to genuine warmth. He stepped around my father without ceremony, without explanation, leaving Richard standing there with his hand still half extended, his pitch dying on his lips. The crowd parted as Dalton walked through the tent, his aide and security following at a respectful distance. I could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes tracking his movement, trying to understand what was happening. The path he took led directly past the head table where Nathan and Victoria sat frozen in confusion, past my mother, whose face had gone white, past Thomas Hartwell, who watched with growing interest. Dalton stopped in front of my table. The great-aunt beside me made a small sound of surprise and pushed her chair back slightly, as if making room for whatever was about to happen. I stood up slowly, maintaining my composure, even as my heart hammered in my chest. This wasn't what I'd expected. I'd thought Dalton would simply attend as a guest, that his presence alone might create some awkward questions for my father. I hadn't anticipated this. His face broke into a smile, the kind of genuine expression he reserved for people he truly respected. Then, in front of 300 stunned guests, in front of the news cameras still recording, in front of my father and brother and everyone who'd just laughed at me, he spoke. Colonel Wells. His voice carried clearly in the silent tent, each word distinct and weighted with significance. I didn't expect to find you here. It's an honor as always. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Colonel Wells. I saw my father's face drain of all color, saw his mouth open and close without sound, saw him look from Dalton to me and back again, trying to reconcile what he'd just heard with everything he'd told himself and everyone else about my insignificant career. Nathan had half risen from his chair, his expression somewhere between shock and disbelief. Victoria's hand flew to her mouth, her perfectly styled hair framing a face of complete confusion. Linda Hartwell leaned toward her husband, whispering urgently. Brad and the groomsmen who'd been laughing minutes ago now sat perfectly still, their expensive suits suddenly looking like costumes on boys playing dress-up. The news cameraman, bless him, had the presence of mind to keep recording. I saw the red light steady on his camera, capturing every moment of this collision between my father's fiction and reality. General Dalton, I said, my voice steady and professional. Sir, this is unexpected. I didn't realize you'd be making a formal appearance. Your presence here was brought to my attention, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. I felt it important to pay my respects properly. After all, it's not every day I have the opportunity to publicly acknowledge one of the finest officers I've had the privilege of working with. The silence was absolute. Even the catering staff had stopped moving, frozen in place with trays half lifted, witnessing something they sensed was important, even if they didn't understand all the implications. My mother made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp. She was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, as if 20 years of my life had suddenly come into focus after existing only as a blur in her peripheral vision. Captain Chen, Victoria's bridesmaid's brother, stood at his table near the front and came to attention, recognizing what was happening even if most civilians didn't fully grasp it. His salute was crisp, automatic, a junior officer acknowledging a superior in the presence of a general. Dalton noticed and nodded to him with approval, then turned his attention back to me. "I apologize for the interruption of your family celebration," he said, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry. "But I wanted to ensure that you knew I'm aware of your presence here. We have some matters to discuss regarding the upcoming operation briefing, but that can wait until Monday." He paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, "I trust you're enjoying your weekend leave, Colonel." Every camera turned. Every whisper died. Dalton turned from me to face the crowd, and I saw the exact moment he registered the strange tension in the room, the shocked faces, the way people were staring at me as if I'd just materialized from thin air. His military instincts kicked in immediately. He was reading the tactical situation, understanding that he'd walked into something more complex than a simple family wedding. But if he was confused, he didn't show it. Instead, he did what generals do. He took command of the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "I apologize for interrupting this celebration, but when I learned that Colonel Wells was in attendance, I felt it necessary to pay my respects properly." He paused, and I could see him making a decision in real time. He'd sensed something wrong in the dynamic, something about the way I'd been seated in the back, the way the family seemed shocked by his acknowledgement of me. And Marcus Dalton hadn't become a 4-star general by ignoring his instincts. "I realize many of you may not be aware," he continued, his tone shifting to something more formal, more deliberate. "But Colonel Erica Wells is one of the most remarkable officers I have had the privilege of serving with in my 35 years of military service." My father made a sound like he'd been punched. His face had gone from white to an alarming shade of red, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. He looked like a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse in real time. "3 years ago," Dalton said, and the tent had gone so quiet I could hear the wind rustling the fabric overhead. "Colonel Wells led a strategic intelligence operation that prevented a catastrophic security breach. Her analysis and quick decision-making saved over 200 American soldiers from walking into what would have been a massacre." I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. She was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, pride mixed with grief, as if she was mourning all the years she'd failed to see me clearly. "She demonstrated strategic brilliance that I've rarely witnessed in my entire career," Dalton continued, warming to his subject, now perhaps realizing that this public testimony served some purpose in the strange dynamics he'd walked into. "She has consistently shown the kind of courage, intelligence, and leadership that represents the very best of our military. Her commendations include the Bronze Star, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, and numerous other honors that remain classified." Nathan had stood up from the head table, his champagne glass forgotten, trembling in his hand. He was staring at me with something between shock and what might have been shame. Beside him, Victoria looked utterly bewildered, her perfect wedding moment hijacked by revelations about her new sister-in-law that contradicted everything she'd been told. Victoria's mother, Linda, was whispering urgently to Thomas, both of them looking at me with new eyes, recalculating everything they'd assumed about the Wells family dynamics. The congressman had pulled out his phone and was typing rapidly, probably Googling my name, trying to find information that would help him understand what he was witnessing. Brad and the groomsmen who'd mocked me in the parking lot looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Their faces had gone pale, their earlier confidence evaporated as they realized they'd been laughing at someone who outranked almost everyone they'd ever met. The local news cameraman had moved closer, sensing that he'd stumbled onto a story far more interesting than a simple society wedding. His camera tracked between Dalton and me, capturing every moment of this bizarre scene. "The truth is," Dalton said, and now he looked directly at my father with an expression that was polite but unmistakably pointed, "Colonel Wells is exactly the kind of officer every father should be proud to call their daughter. She has served her country with distinction and honor, making sacrifices most civilians will never understand or appreciate." My father's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out. He looked like a man drowning in full view of everyone, unable to call for help, unable to save himself from the undertow of truth that was pulling him under. I needed to regain control of this situation before it spiraled further. As much as I appreciated Dalton's recognition, this was still Nathan's wedding, and despite everything, I didn't want to completely destroy what should have been his day. "At ease, General," I said, using the formal military language, deliberately establishing my authority in a way the crowd couldn't miss. "Sir, with respect, this is a family celebration. Let's not make it about work." Dalton looked at me, and I saw understanding flash in his eyes. He recognized what I was doing, giving everyone an out, a way to step back from the edge of this confrontation. But he shook his head slightly. "Colonel, I'm afraid I must disagree," he said. "I owe you a personal debt that I've never properly acknowledged. When you rerouted that mission 12 years ago against direct orders, you saved my nephew's life. He was one of those 12 soldiers in that convoy." The words landed like an artillery strike. 12 years ago. Against direct orders. 12 soldiers saved. I watched the implications register on my father's face. Watched him make the connection to Afghanistan, to the mission that had ended his career, to the report I'd filed that had led to his disgrace. Watched him realize that the man he'd been desperately trying to impress, the man whose company he'd hoped to partner with, was personally grateful for the exact action that had destroyed Richard Wells' military career. The irony was so devastating I almost felt sorry for him. "Your decision that day," Dalton continued, apparently determined to lay everything out in the open, was an act of moral courage that exemplifies everything we try to instill in our officers. You chose to save lives over following orders, and you were willing to sacrifice your career to do it. That's the kind of character that can't be taught. Nathan had sat back down heavily, as if his legs wouldn't support him anymore. His face had gone through several expressions in rapid succession: shock, understanding, shame, and finally a kind of hollow recognition of how thoroughly he'd been complicit in my father's narrative. People at the surrounding tables were whispering now, the sound building like distant thunder. I caught fragments of conversation. "She saved those soldiers. Against orders. Her own father. 200 lives." The news reporter had definitely caught the significance. He was speaking quietly into his phone, probably calling his editor, already writing the headline in his mind. This wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a story about military heroism, family dysfunction, and the public unmasking of a lie that had lasted 12 years. Dalton extended his hand to me formally. "Colonel Wells, I hope you'll allow me to stay for the remainder of the reception. I'd consider it an honor to celebrate with you and your family." The way he said "your family" carried a subtle emphasis, as if he was claiming me as worthy of celebration regardless of whether my blood relatives agreed. I shook his hand, maintaining my composure even though my mind was racing. "Of course, General. We're honored by your presence." He nodded and turned to find a seat, his security detail relaxing slightly, but remaining alert. His aide pulled out a chair at a nearby table, and the guests already seated there looked both terrified and thrilled to suddenly be sharing space with a 4-star general. The DJ, sensing an opportunity to break the tension, started the music again, something upbeat and meaningless. A few people began talking in normal voices, trying to pretend the last 10 minutes hadn't completely upended everything they thought they knew about the Wells family. But nothing would be normal again. I looked across the tent at my father, who still stood frozen near the entrance, his moment of triumph turned to ashes. At my mother, crying openly now, whether from joy or sorrow or both, I couldn't tell. At Nathan, who wouldn't meet my eyes. but humiliation was just the beginning. I left the reception early, slipping out while people were still processing what had happened, still whispering in clusters, still trying to reconcile the woman they'd dismissed with the officer Dalton had described. I didn't say goodbye to anyone except my mother, who hugged me tightly in the parking lot and whispered, "I'm so sorry," over and over, until I gently pulled away and drove back to my hotel. The next morning I woke to 17 missed calls and 43 text messages. My phone had been on silent, and I'd slept heavily exhausted by the emotional toll of the weekend. I made coffee in the small hotel room machine and sat on the bed scrolling through the notifications with growing disbelief. The video had already gone viral. Someone at the wedding, probably multiple someones, had recorded my father's toast on their phones. The footage was everywhere: Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Clips of him saying "our desk soldier" followed immediately by Dalton's dramatic entrance and his public testimony about my service. The contrast was devastating in its clarity. My father's mockery caught in high definition, his face flushed with wine and satisfaction. Then Dalton's measured words about strategic brilliance, saved lives, moral courage. The story had been picked up by local news first, then regional outlets, and by morning it was trending nationally. The headlines varied, but the theme was consistent. Father mocks daughter at wedding, doesn't know she's decorated colonel. Viral video shows war hero humiliated by family. The desk soldier who saved 200 lives. I watched one of the videos, seeing myself stand calmly after my father's toast, raising my glass with steady hands, responding with those few words that now felt prophetic. The comments section was overwhelming. Thousands of them, tens of thousands, all expressing outrage on my behalf, admiration for my composure, condemnation of my father's behavior. Hashtags were trending. I saw hashtag desk soldier being used, ironically reclaimed as a badge of honor. Chad Colonel Wells had thousands of posts from veterans sharing their own stories of being underestimated. Quiet Power was full of women talking about silent strength, about not needing to announce your achievements to validate them. My phone rang again. I recognized the number as a national morning show. Before I could decline, another call came through from a different network. Then my email started filling with interview requests from newspapers, magazines, podcasts. Everyone wanted my story, wanted me to elaborate on the video, to talk about my father, to discuss military service and family dynamics, and what it meant to be a woman in the armed forces. I turned off my phone. The attention felt surreal and fundamentally wrong. None of this was why I'd served. I hadn't spent 20 years in the military so I could become a viral sensation or a symbol for other people's grievances against their families. The work I did mattered, because it protected people, because it served a purpose larger than personal vindication. Turning my father's humiliation and our family's dysfunction into entertainment felt like a betrayal of everything I'd tried to be. I packed my bag, checked out of the hotel, and drove back to Washington. The 6-hour drive gave me time to think, to process, to understand what had actually happened. My father had tried to diminish me publicly to cement his narrative one final time, and instead he'd exposed himself. Not because I'd fought back or defended myself, but because reality had simply showed up in the form of Marcus Dalton and corrected the record. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph. Just a profound sadness that it had come to this, that my father's pride was so fragile it could only be maintained through my diminishment, and that the walls he'd built around his lies had finally collapsed in the most public way possible. By the time I reached my apartment, the story had evolved. News outlets were digging into my father's military record, finding the old reports about his forced retirement, connecting the dots between the mission I'd rerouted and his subsequent disgrace. Think pieces were being written about toxic family dynamics, about fathers who competed with their children, about women in the military facing discrimination from the people who should support them most. My mother called. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Erica," her voice was thick with tears. "Honey, I'm so sorry. I should have stopped him. All those years I should have said something, done something. I was so afraid of making things worse that I just let it happen. Mom, it's not your fault. It is, she insisted. I chose him over you over and over. I let you carry the blame for saving those soldiers' lives. I let him tell everyone you were nothing, and I said nothing. We talked for an hour. She told me my father had locked himself in his study, refusing to speak to anyone. That Nathan had tried to apologize, but didn't know what to say. That she was thinking about leaving, about finally doing what she should have done decades ago. I told her I loved her, that she'd done the best she could in an impossible situation, that I didn't blame her even if maybe I should. After we hung up, my phone rang again. This time it was Dalton calling from his personal line. Colonel Wells, he said, his voice warm but concerned. I wanted to check on you. I've seen the media coverage. I apologize if my presence yesterday created difficulties for you. Sir, you have nothing to apologize for. You told the truth. That's never wrong. You handled that situation with more grace than most generals I know, he said. Your father will face consequences from his own choices, not from you. That's real strength, Erica. Responding with dignity instead of anger, not taking the opportunity to humiliate him back. He humiliated himself, I said quietly. I didn't need to help. Dalton was quiet for a moment. The media wants you to comment to turn this into your moment. But you won't, will you? No, sir, this isn't about me. That's why you're one of the finest officers I've served with, he said. Most people would use this opportunity. You're choosing to let your work speak for itself. We talked for a few more minutes about work matters, upcoming briefings, the normal flow of duties that felt grounding after the chaos of the weekend. As we were ending the call, I asked him about my next assignment when I'd be needed back at the Pentagon, what projects were coming up. He laughed softly. You just became a national news story, and you're asking about your work schedule. That's exactly who you are. After the call ended, I sat in my quiet apartment and watched the sun set over the city. My phone continued to buzz with notifications I was ignoring. Somewhere in Virginia, my family was dealing with the aftermath of truths finally spoken. Somewhere online, strangers were debating and discussing and making me into a symbol I'd never asked to be. But here alone, I was just Erica. The woman who'd chosen service over approval duty, over family peace, truth over comfortable lies. The woman who didn't need the world's validation because she'd earned her own respect through years of quiet, consistent work. Grace can be sharper than steel. For 3 days, the story dominated social media and news cycles, then began its natural fade as new controversies emerged to capture public attention. I returned to work grateful for the routine of briefings and analysis, the familiar rhythm of a job that made sense, even when nothing else did. My colleagues were professional enough not to mention it directly, though. I noticed a new respect in how they addressed me, a carefulness that suggested they'd seen the videos and recalibrated their understanding of who I was. Then the whispers started. It began subtly, the way poison often does. A blog post on a conservative military forum questioning the timeline of my promotions. How does someone make colonel by 38? It asked, with just enough reasonableness to sound like legitimate inquiry rather than accusation. What connections did she have? What corners were cut? I dismissed it as the usual internet noise, the kind of skepticism women in leadership always faced. But then more posts appeared, all asking similar questions with slightly different angles. They never accused me directly of wrongdoing, just raised doubts, planted seeds of uncertainty. Why didn't her family know about her achievements? Wouldn't a real hero want her parents at promotion ceremonies? Convenient that a 4-star general showed up at exactly the right moment. Who arranged that? Who benefits from this story? Notice how she refuses all interviews. What is Colonel Wells hiding? The posts were too coordinated to be organic, too carefully worded to be random trolling. Someone was orchestrating this, and I had a sinking suspicion about who. By the end of the week, the narrative had shifted in certain circles. A podcast popular with military skeptics devoted an entire episode to unanswered questions about my service record. A former officer who'd been discharged for ethics violations went on a right-wing news network suggesting that my rapid advancement suggested favoritism or worse. He was careful to couch everything in speculation, never quite crossing the line into actionable defamation, but the implication was clear. The story got picked up by outlets already skeptical of women in combat roles, already primed to believe that any successful woman must have cheated somehow. Opinion pieces appeared questioning whether the military's push for diversity had led to lowered standards. My name was used as evidence, my career dissected by people who'd never served, never sacrificed, never understood what it took to earn each promotion I'd received. The doubt campaign was sophisticated and surgical. They didn't attack my character directly, that would be too easy to disprove and would generate sympathy. Instead, they attacked the narrative itself, suggesting the viral video was staged or exaggerated, that Dalton's praise was politically motivated, that the whole thing was a publicity stunt designed to advance some unnamed agenda. Social media accounts with generic names and stock photos began flooding comment sections with questions. Why won't she release her full service record? What about the other soldiers on that mission? Why aren't they speaking up? Isn't it suspicious that this happened at her brother's wedding? Seems like attention-seeking. My inbox filled with emails from journalists who'd previously written supportive pieces, now asking for comment on allegations that I'd misrepresented my service, or that my father's version of events might have validity after all. The framing had shifted from hero humiliated by family to family drama with unclear truth. I sat in my office reviewing an intelligence assessment when Colonel Morrison stopped by, closing the door behind her with unusual formality. "Erica, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." Her tone was serious, almost apologetic. "Is there anything in your service record that could be misinterpreted? Anything that might not look good under intense scrutiny?" The question landed like a body blow. "You're asking if the smear campaign has merit." "I'm asking if you're prepared for what's coming," she said carefully. "Someone with resources is trying very hard to discredit you. Your record is impeccable. I know that Dalton knows that, everyone who's worked with you knows that. But the court of public opinion doesn't care about facts. They care about narratives." She was right, and we both knew it. My military record was bulletproof. Every promotion had been earned, every commendation justified, every decision documented and reviewed. But that didn't matter if people were determined to believe otherwise. "I've been contacted by 3 reporters in the past 2 days," Morrison continued, "all asking about favoritism, about whether your rapid advancement raised concerns, about whether there were complaints. I told them the truth, that you're one of the most qualified officers I've known. But they're not looking for truth, Erica. They're looking for controversy." After she left, I tried to focus on work, but concentration proved impossible. My phone showed 12 missed calls from my mother, each voicemail more distressed than the last. I couldn't bring myself to listen to them. Whatever she wanted to say, apology, explanation, warning, I didn't have the emotional capacity to process it. That evening, alone in my apartment, I searched my father's name. I found what I was looking for almost immediately. Richard Wells had hired Thornton Strategic Communications, a PR firm with a reputation for aggressive crisis management and what they euphemistically called narrative correction. Their client list included disgraced politicians, executives accused of misconduct, and anyone willing to pay their substantial fees to rebuild a damaged reputation. The strategy was clear now. My father couldn't undo what had happened at the wedding, couldn't erase the video or take back his words. But he could muddy the waters, create enough doubt that people would question whether he'd been wrong to mock me. If my achievements weren't real, if my rank was inflated, if the whole story was somehow fabricated, then his behavior became understandable, even justified. He was trying to save himself by destroying my credibility. A coughing fit seized me, suddenly more violent than the previous ones. I doubled over, hand pressed to my chest, feeling the sharp pain that had been growing more persistent over the past weeks. When it finally subsided, I sat on my couch, breathing carefully, tasting something metallic in my throat. I should have seen a doctor weeks ago, should have addressed the fatigue, the persistent cough, the weight loss I'd been attributing to stress. But acknowledging physical weakness felt dangerous right now when my professional strength was under attack. My phone buzzed again. Another news alert, another article questioning my service. This one included a quote from a retired general I'd never met, suggesting that the military's diversity initiatives had potentially compromised promotion standards. My name was mentioned as a possible example. I set the phone down and stared at the wall of my apartment. For 20 years, I'd built my reputation on integrity, competence, and results. I'd never cut corners, never traded on connections, never asked for special treatment. I'd worked harder than my male peers and been held to higher standards, and I'd met those standards consistently. And now my own father was using that hard-earned reputation as a weapon against me, hiring professionals to systematically dismantle it through innuendo and doubt. The cruelty was breathtaking. He couldn't challenge my record through official channels; it would never survive scrutiny. So instead, he was poisoning the well of public opinion, knowing that once doubt was planted, it was almost impossible to fully eradicate. This wasn't like facing an enemy in combat or a hostile actor in intelligence work. Those opponents followed rules, operated within systems I understood. This was something more insidious, a campaign designed to make people question not just my achievements, but my basic integrity. He used the one weapon I couldn't fight with: force, my honor. The secure conference room at the Pentagon was windowless and soundproof, designed for conversations that couldn't risk being overheard. I'd been summoned there by Dalton's office with minimal explanation, just a terse message that he needed to speak with me urgently regarding a sensitive matter. I assumed it was about the smear campaign, but I wasn't prepared for what he had waiting for me. Dalton sat at the head of the table with 3 folders arranged in front of him, each marked with security classifications. His expression was grave in a way I'd rarely seen, the kind of look he wore when delivering news about casualties or mission failures. "Colonel Wells, thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the chair beside him. "What I'm about to show you was obtained through official channels, but the implications are personal. I want you to understand that before we proceed." He opened the first folder and slid it toward me. Inside were financial records, transaction histories, corporate filings. It took me a moment to make sense of what I was seeing, but then the pattern emerged with sickening clarity. Thornton Strategic Communications was hired 2 days after the wedding video went viral. Dalton explained, his voice carefully neutral. The retainer was $50,000 with additional performance bonuses tied to media pickup. The payment came from an LLC registered to your brother Nathan's real estate company. I stared at the document, seeing Nathan's business name, seeing the dates, seeing the signature that I recognized as my father's, even though it was technically unauthorized on Nathan's corporate accounts. "There's more," Dalton continued, opening the second folder. "Phone records show 17 calls between your father and the PR firm's founder in the past 10 days. Email correspondence outlines the strategy: explicitly don't deny the wedding incident, but create reasonable doubt about your service record. Make people question the narrative without providing evidence. Let speculation do the work." The third folder contained screenshots of social media posts, blog entries, forum discussions. Each one marked with analysis showing coordinated timing, similar phrasing, identical talking points. It was a professionally orchestrated campaign, not organic skepticism. "They're working together," I said quietly, though I'd already suspected as much. "My father and Nathan." "Your brother is funding it. Your father is directing it," Dalton confirmed. "And they're doing it because they believe you won't fight back. They're counting on you to stay silent, to wait for it to blow over, to protect them the way you always have." I looked up at him, seeing concern in his eyes mixed with something else. Anger, perhaps. Or disappointment that this was happening to an officer he respected. "Sir, with respect, what am I supposed to do if I respond publicly? I play into their hands. They want me to look defensive, to seem like I'm hiding something. The best strategy is to let my record speak for itself." "Normally, yes," Dalton said, leaning back in his chair. "But Erica, this isn't a normal situation. Your father isn't some random internet troll. He's leveraging his military background to give credibility to these attacks. People who don't know better assume he'd know the truth about his own daughter's career. And the longer you stay silent, the more his version gains traction." He pulled out another document, this one a report from the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. We're getting inquiries from congressional staffers from military oversight committees. People are asking questions about promotion standards, about whether favoritism played a role in your advancement. Your silence is being interpreted as evasion. The words hit hard because they were true. I'd spent my career believing that good work was its own defense, that integrity didn't require public performance. But that philosophy assumed good faith actors, people who cared about truth. My father wasn't operating in good faith. He was waging psychological warfare against his own daughter. Sometimes silence doesn't preserve honor. Dalton said, his tone gentler now. Sometimes it lets lies grow into truth. Your father understands that. He's counting on you staying quiet while he rewrites history, just like you stayed quiet 12 years ago when he blamed you for his failures. The comparison stung because it was accurate. I'd protected my father, then accepting the role of family villain to spare him further humiliation. And he'd rewarded that sacrifice by spending 12 years making me pay for it. What are you suggesting, sir? I'm suggesting you stop protecting people who are actively trying to destroy you, he said bluntly. Release your full military record, every commendation, every evaluation, every mission summary that isn't still classified. Let journalists see exactly what you've accomplished. Let the veterans who served with you speak on record about your leadership. Show the world that the doubt being planted is a calculated lie. I stood up and walked to the far end of the room, needing space to think. Everything in me resisted this approach. Putting my service on display felt like bragging, like using achievements that should stand alone as weapons in a family dispute. But staying silent meant letting my father's lies define reality. He'll claim I'm retaliating, I said, that I'm using my position to punish him for telling uncomfortable truths. He's already punishing you for succeeding where he failed, Dalton countered. Erica, I've known you for 6 years. I've watched you deflect credit, minimize your achievements, stay in the background while others took recognition for work you led. That humility serves you well in military circles. But right now, it's being weaponized against you. I turned back to face him. If I do this, there's no going back. My relationship with my father, with Nathan, whatever's left of it, will be destroyed completely. Was there ever really a relationship? Dalton asked quietly. Or just you accommodating their need to diminish you? The question hung in the air, stark and painful. I thought about my childhood, about constantly trying to earn my father's approval by shrinking myself. About Nathan learning that loving me openly cost him parental favor. About my mother begging me to keep the peace by accepting blame for things I hadn't done wrong. When had any of them actually seen me? When had they celebrated my achievements without resentment, supported my choices without criticism, loved me without conditions? What exactly are you proposing? I asked. Dalton opened his laptop and turned it toward me. On the screen was a contact list, military journalists known for fair reporting, veterans advocacy organizations, retired officers with credibility and large platforms. I have relationships with these people built over 35 years of service, he said. I can facilitate direct access to your complete record with appropriate redactions for classified material. I can connect you with soldiers you served with who want to speak publicly about your leadership. I can provide documentation that makes it impossible for reasonable people to doubt your achievements. He paused, meeting my eyes directly. But I won't do any of it without your explicit authorization. This has to be your decision, not mine. I'll support whatever you choose, including continued silence. But I need you to choose consciously, not out of habit. I looked at the folders on the table, the evidence of my family's betrayal, laid out in financial records and email trails. I thought about 20 years of service, of missions accomplished and lives saved, and difficult decisions made with integrity. I thought about the young female officers who'd thanked me for showing them they belonged, who'd said my example gave them courage to stay when the environment made them want to quit. And I thought about my father hiring professionals to systematically destroy everything I'd built, confident that I'd never fight back because I never had before. Do it, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion churning underneath. Release everything that's legally permissible. Connect me with anyone who wants to speak on the record. No more protecting him at my own expense. Dalton nodded, something like approval crossing his features. Are you sure once we start this there's no taking it back? I'm sure, I said. No more lies, just truth. Whatever consequences come from that are his responsibility, not mine. I walked back to the table and picked up the folder containing my brother's financial records, looking at the evidence of his complicity. Nathan had always been the golden child, but he'd also once been a little boy who looked up to his big sister. Somewhere along the way, our father had poisoned that relationship, teaching him that success required my failure, that his value depended on my worthlessness. I set the folder down, feeling something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, but a clear-eyed acceptance of reality. These people weren't going to change. They weren't going to suddenly see me, value me, treat me with the basic respect I'd spent decades trying to earn. The only thing I could change was my own participation in the dynamic. General Dalton, I said formally, you have my authorization to proceed with full transparency regarding my military service record. I'll make myself available for any legitimate inquiries from credible sources, and I'll stop protecting people who see my silence as permission to lie. He stood and extended his hand. That's the Erica Wells I know, the one who chooses truth even when it costs her. As I shook his hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not vindication or satisfaction, but simple self-respect. The kind that comes from finally standing up for yourself even against people you once desperately wanted to love you. I was done being the forgiving daughter. 2 days after I authorized the release of my military records, Dalton called me back to the Pentagon. His voice on the phone carried a weight I hadn't heard before, something beyond concern or support. It sounded like dread. When I arrived at the same secure conference room, I found him sitting with 2 additional people, a woman I recognized from the Inspector General's office, and a man whose credentials identified him as DOD fraud investigation. The atmosphere had shifted from personal support to official inquiry, and my stomach tightened with foreboding. Colonel Wells, please sit down, Dalton said, his formality signaling this wasn't just about the smear campaign anymore. What we're about to discuss involves your brother's business dealings and has potential national security implications. The woman from the IG's office slid a thick folder across the table. Colonel, while conducting due diligence on the source of funds used to hire the PR firm attacking you, we uncovered irregularities in Nathan Wells Development Corporation's financial records. What started as a simple transaction trace revealed a pattern of systematic fraud. I opened the folder with hands that had started trembling. Inside were financial statements, investor prospectuses, property appraisals, loan applications, all bearing Nathan's company name, all showing discrepancies highlighted in yellow. Your brother has been inflating property values by 30 to 50% in investor materials, the fraud investigator explained. He's used fabricated appraisals to secure loans he couldn't otherwise qualify for. He's promised returns based on defense contracts he claimed were secured, but which don't actually exist. I felt sick reading the details. Properties purchased for $2 million listed at $3 million in investor documents. Appraisals signed by inspectors who, when contacted, had no record of evaluating the buildings. Projections for military housing developments presented as guaranteed when they were barely in proposal stages. How much money are we talking about? I asked quietly. Approximately $18 million in fraudulent investor funding over the past 3 years, the woman said. But that's not the worst part. She opened another section of the folder, and I saw email correspondence, meeting notes, wire transfer records from overseas accounts. My brother's name appeared repeatedly alongside names I didn't recognize, companies registered in countries known for loose financial oversight. Nathan has been courting foreign investors primarily from China and Russia. Dalton said, his voice tight with controlled anger. He's been telling them he has family connections to high-level Defense Department officials. He's implied he can influence military contract decisions through these connections. The words landed like physical blows. He told foreign nationals he could influence defense contracts. He didn't name you explicitly, the investigator clarified, but he referenced having a sister in military intelligence with access to senior leadership. He's essentially been selling access that doesn't exist, making promises about contract outcomes he has no ability to deliver. I stared at the documents, seeing my brother's signature on letters to foreign investors, seeing promises about defense housing projects near military bases, seeing references to inside information and strategic advantages that could only come from compromised sources. This could constitute espionage-adjacent activity, Dalton said carefully. At minimum, it's securities fraud and ethics violations. At worst, if any of these foreign entities believed they were gaining actual access to defense information, it becomes a counterintelligence matter. The room felt too small, suddenly the air too thin. My brother hadn't just committed fraud. He'd potentially compromised national security by suggesting our family had exploitable connections to military decision-making. What happens now? I asked. That depends partly on you, the IG representative said. You're the family connection he referenced. We need to know if he ever approached you directly about contracts, if he ever asked for information, if there was any actual breach of protocol. Never, I said immediately. Nathan and I barely spoke. He never asked me about my work, never showed any interest in what I actually did. This was all fabrication. We believe you, Dalton said. But the question remains, do we pursue full prosecution? The fraud charges alone could result in significant prison time. The national security implications could make it worse. Or we could force restitution to investors, revoke his business licenses, and handle it quietly. He paused, and I understood why I was really here. You want to know what I want, I said. No, Dalton corrected gently. I want to know what you can live with. Because once we move forward with this, there's no going back. Your brother will face consequences that will destroy his life as he knows it. And you'll be the person whose cooperation made it possible. I looked at the evidence spread across the table, thinking about the Nathan I'd grown up with. The little boy who used to build elaborate block towers and cry when they fell. The teenager who'd been terrified before his first date and asked me for advice he pretended not to need. The young man who'd hugged me at the airport before my first deployment and whispered, "Be safe," like it was a prayer. Somewhere along the way, my father's poison had transformed him into this, a man so desperate to live up to impossible expectations that he'd commit fraud so hungry for success that he'd risk national security, so willing to use me without ever actually knowing me. The investors he defrauded, I said slowly. Are any of them ordinary people, retirees' families? Several, the investigator confirmed. People who trusted him with their savings based on his promises of guaranteed returns. I thought about those people, about families who'd believed my brother's lies and lost money they couldn't afford to lose. I thought about the foreign actors who might have believed they were buying access to American military intelligence. I thought about the soldiers whose lives depended on contract integrity, on systems that couldn't be compromised by people trading favors for profit. And I thought about what my silence would mean. Another accommodation. Another time I protected my family at the expense of everyone else. Pursue full prosecution, I said, my voice steady despite the pain blooming in my chest. He broke laws. He hurt people. He potentially compromised national security. That can't be overlooked because he's my brother. Dalton studied my face. Are you certain this will destroy any remaining relationship with your family? There is no relationship, I said quietly. There's just patterns we keep repeating, and I'm done repeating them. Family or justice, choose one. After the fraud investigators left with their files and grim purpose, Dalton asked me to stay. The room felt larger with just the two of us, the silence heavier. He stood and walked to the window, though there was nothing to see through the reinforced glass except the corridor outside. There's something I need to tell you, he said, his back still turned. Something I should have told you years ago, but the timing never felt right. Now, given everything that's happening, you deserve to know the full story." I waited, sensing this was something significant, something that had been weighing on him. He turned to face me, and I saw an expression I'd never witnessed on his face before, something vulnerable beneath the general's bearing. 12 years ago, I was the theater commander overseeing operations in Helmand Province. I was the one who reviewed your report about the mission where you disobeyed your father's orders. The words took a moment to register. You were the commanding general, but I never saw you. Never. I was there for the aftermath, he said, coming back to sit across from me. I arrived at the extraction point 6 hours after your team secured it. I saw the Taliban ambush position you'd avoided. I walked the route your father had ordered, saw exactly where his convoy would have been destroyed, and I interviewed every soldier you saved that day. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos, then handed it to me. The image showed a younger version of Dalton in desert fatigues standing with a group of soldiers, all of them looking exhausted but alive. I recognized Rodriguez immediately and several other faces from that mission. They told me about the young captain who'd defied direct orders because she knew they were wrong. Dalton continued. They said you'd been calm, certain that you'd explained the intelligence, and then made the call when your commanding officer refused to listen. Rodriguez told me you turned off your radio and said, "I'll take the court-martial. I won't take your deaths." I remembered that moment, remembered the weight of the decision, the certainty that I was ending my career but couldn't live with the alternative. I reviewed your intelligence analysis, Dalton said. It was flawless. Every conclusion you'd drawn was supported by evidence. Your father had ignored it not because it was wrong, but because accepting it would have meant admitting his daughter knew better than he did. He took his phone back and pulled up another image, a formal document with official letterhead. I wrote a commendation that day. The Soldier's Medal for heroism not involving actual conflict with the enemy. You'd saved 12 lives through moral courage and tactical excellence. I submitted it through channels expecting it to be processed within months. I never received any commendation for that mission, I said quietly. I know. It got buried in bureaucracy held up by officers who were sympathetic to your father, who thought you'd been insubordinate regardless of the outcome. I followed up twice, but by then I'd moved to a different command and it fell through the cracks. He stood and retrieved a folder from his briefcase, setting it in front of me. Inside was the original commendation he'd written, the paper yellowed slightly with age, his signature at the bottom. I've been looking for you for a decade, Dalton said, his voice carrying emotion I'd never heard from him. After I became CEO of Dalton Defense, I tried to track down the captain from that mission, but your name had been redacted in some reports because of the investigation into your father. All I knew was that a young intelligence officer had shown extraordinary courage, and I wanted to properly recognize it. I stared at the document, at the words he'd written 12 years ago, describing my actions, seeing my own history reflected back through someone else's eyes. When I saw you at that wedding, he continued, sitting in the back while your father mocked you, and then I heard him say your name, Erica Wells, daughter of Richard Wells. Everything clicked into place. The young captain I'd been searching for was Richard's daughter. The officer he'd blamed for his downfall was the same one who'd saved those 12 soldiers. He sat back down, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. I finally understood why he resented you so deeply. You became the officer he could never be. You made the hard choice he couldn't make. You put soldiers' lives above your career, above your relationship with your commanding officer, above everything. And every day you continued to succeed in the military reminded him of his own failure. The pieces of my history were rearranging themselves, taking on new meaning. The man who'd shaped my career, who'd mentored me, who'd stood up for me at the wedding, had been there at the defining moment of my life. He'd witnessed what I'd done and spent years trying to find me to acknowledge it properly. The commendation is being resubmitted, Dalton said, this time with my current authority behind it and with testimonies from the soldiers you saved who are still in service. It will go through. You'll receive the recognition you earned 12 years ago. I looked at him, this man who'd shaped not just my recent years, but the trajectory of my entire career without my knowing it. Why are you telling me this now? Because you need to understand that your value, your worth as an officer and a person was never in question, he said firmly. Your father's version of events was always a lie. The military knew it. I knew it. Everyone who mattered knew it. You saved lives that day, Erica. You did exactly what an officer should do, and you've spent 12 years being punished for it by the one person who should have been most proud. He tapped the old commendation with his finger. You've never needed his approval. You had mine from the moment I read your report and interviewed those soldiers. You've had the respect of everyone who actually understood what happened. The only person who didn't see your value was him, and that's his failure, not yours. The hero he sought was standing right there. 3 days after my conversation with Dalton, someone knocked on my apartment door at 9 in the evening. I wasn't expecting visitors, and the tentative nature of the knock made me cautious as I checked the peephole. My mother stood in the hallway looking diminished in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. She wore an old cardigan despite the mild weather, and she clutched a worn envelope against her chest like a shield. I opened the door and she flinched slightly at the sight of me, as if she'd half expected I wouldn't let her in. "Mom, what are you doing here? I needed to see you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I needed to give you something before—" She stopped, swallowed hard. "May I come in?" I stepped aside and she entered my small apartment with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. She'd never been here before. In all the years I'd lived in Washington, she'd never visited, always finding reasons why the trip was too difficult, too expensive, too complicated. She sat on my couch without being invited, still clutching the envelope. I noticed her hands trembling, the knuckles white from gripping too hard. "Would you like some tea?" I offered, falling back on hospitality because I didn't know what else to do. "No, thank you. I just need to—" She held out the envelope toward me. "I found this in your father's desk. It was hidden in the back of a drawer behind old tax documents. I think he wanted it hidden even from himself." I took the envelope. It was addressed to me in my father's handwriting, but there was no postmark, no stamp. The paper was worn at the edges as if it had been handled many times. "He wrote that 5 years ago," my mother said. "I should have given it to you then. I should have made him send it. But I was afraid of what it would do to our family, what it would mean if he admitted—" Her voice broke. "I was a coward, Erica. I chose his comfort over your right to know the truth." I sat in the chair across from her and opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper filled with my father's handwriting, less steady than usual, as if written in emotional turmoil. Erica. It began no formal greeting, just my name like an admission. "I am writing this because I can no longer carry the weight of what I've done to you. I don't know if I'll ever have the courage to send this, but I need to say these words even if only paper hears them. You were right. 12 years ago in Afghanistan, you were right and I was wrong. You saved 12 lives that day, and I nearly killed them through my arrogance and refusal to listen. I've told myself for over a decade that you betrayed me, that you destroyed my career out of ambition or spite. But that's a lie I created because the truth was unbearable. The truth is that you were a better officer at 26 than I was at 45. You had the courage to disobey orders when those orders would have led to catastrophe. You chose soldiers over your own career, and I should have been proud of you. Instead, I blamed you because I couldn't face myself. I turned my daughter into my enemy because it was easier than accepting I was never the hero I pretended to be. Every time I see you, I'm reminded of my failure, and I've punished you for that reminder. I've told Nathan and your mother and anyone who would listen that you were the problem, that you were difficult and disloyal. But the problem was always me. You became the officer I failed to be, and I couldn't forgive you for it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that somewhere in this bitter, broken man is a father who knows exactly what he lost when he chose pride over his daughter. The letter wasn't signed, as if he couldn't bring himself to claim the words even in private. I read it twice, feeling tears slip down my cheeks before I even realized I was crying. These weren't the angry tears I'd shed as a young woman, or the frustrated tears of trying to earn love from someone incapable of giving it. These were tears of grief for what could have been for the relationship we might have had if he'd been able to overcome his pride for the father who knew the truth, but couldn't speak it. He knew, I said, my voice thick with emotion. All these years he knew, and he couldn't help himself, my mother said, crying now too. The truth and his pride were at war, and pride won every time. But Erica, he kept that letter. He could have destroyed it, but he kept it. I think some part of him hoped he'd find the courage to give it to you someday. I looked at her, seeing the exhaustion of decades spent managing a man's ego, absorbing his rage, making excuses for behavior that had no excuse. Why didn't you leave him? She was quiet for a long moment. Because I loved who he used to be, and I kept hoping that man would come back. But he never did. The war broke something in him, and losing his career finished the job. By the time I understood he wasn't coming back, I'd forgotten how to be anyone other than his caretaker. She reached out and took my hand, her touch papery and cold. He's not well, Erica. The doctors found pancreatic cancer, stage 4. They're saying months, not years. The words should have shocked me, but instead they felt inevitable, as if my father's body had finally caught up with the poison he'd been carrying in his soul. A cough seized me then, sharp and sudden, cutting through the emotional moment with physical urgency. I turned away, covering my mouth, feeling the now familiar burn in my chest. When it subsided, I tasted copper. My mother was watching me with alarm. "How long have you been coughing like that?" "It's nothing. Stress." "Erica, that's not stress. That's..." She stopped, seeming to realize she had no right to maternal concern after years of maternal failure. "Please see a doctor." I folded the letter carefully and put it back in its envelope. My father's confession, his admission of guilt, his acknowledgement that he'd destroyed our relationship through his own weakness. It changed nothing and everything simultaneously. Forgiveness isn't weakness, it's timing. The boardroom at Dalton Defense Headquarters was designed to intimidate floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Potomac, a table that could seat 30 people, portraits of military leaders lining the walls. I sat between Dalton and a JAG officer named Captain Morris, facing the company's board of directors and 2 federal prosecutors. My brother sat at the far end of the table with his lawyer, a slick corporate attorney who'd probably cost him $50,000 just to show up. Nathan had been summoned under the pretense of discussing contract opportunities. He'd arrived confident, wearing an expensive suit and the easy smile of someone who believed his charm could navigate any situation. That confidence had evaporated the moment he'd walked in and seen me sitting there in uniform, flanked by military legal counsel. Dalton opened the meeting with clinical precision. "Gentlemen, we're here to address serious allegations of fraud and potential national security breaches involving Nathan Wells Development Corporation. Colonel Wells, you have the floor." I stood, opened my laptop, and connected it to the projection system. The first slide appeared on the wall-mounted screen, a summary of Nathan's corporate structure, his financing sources, his claimed assets. Over the past 3 years, I began, keeping my voice steady and professional. Nathan Wells Development has raised approximately $18 million from private investors based on representations that were materially false. Property values were inflated by 30 to 50%. Development projects were presented as secured when no contracts existed. Returns were promised based on defense housing contracts that were never actually awarded. I advanced through the slides, methodically, side-by-side comparisons of property values in investor documents versus actual appraisals emails showing Nathan instructing subordinates to alter financial projections, bank records documenting the flow of money from investors to personal accounts. Nathan's lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but my brother's face had gone pale. He was staring at the screen as if unable to believe this evidence existed, as if he'd convinced himself his deceptions were too clever to be traced. More concerning from a national security perspective, I continued advancing to a new section of slides. Mr. Wells has been courting foreign investors from China and Russia, making representations about his ability to influence U.S. military contract decisions through family connections to Defense Department officials. The next slide showed email correspondence with Chinese nationals, Nathan's words promising inside access and strategic advantages in securing military contracts. Another showed wire transfers from Russian accounts payments for consultations about navigating defense procurement processes. To be clear, I said, looking directly at the prosecutors, Mr. Wells never approached me for information. He never asked about my work or attempted to compromise my position. He fabricated these connections entirely, selling access he didn't have to investors who believed they were buying influence over American military contracts. One of the prosecutors spoke up. Colonel Wells, help us understand your role here. Why are you presenting this evidence rather than simply cooperating with an investigation? I met his eyes steadily. Because these investors were defrauded and soldiers' lives depend on contract integrity that can't be compromised by people trading imaginary favors for profit. This isn't personal. It's institutional responsibility. Nathan finally found his voice. This is insane, Erica. You're taking things out of context. Every developer exaggerates projections, it's standard practice. And the foreign investors, they were just exploring opportunities like everyone else. You're making this sound criminal when it's just business. Fraud is criminal, Captain Morris interjected. Misrepresenting material facts to induce investment is securities fraud. Suggesting you can influence military contracts through corrupt means violates multiple federal statutes. Nathan's lawyer tried a different approach. My client may have been overly optimistic in his presentations, but there was no intent to defraud. Any discrepancies can be explained by market fluctuations and honest mistakes in valuation. I pulled up another slide showing internal emails where Nathan explicitly instructed employees to falsify documents. His own words unambiguous and damning. These aren't mistakes, I said quietly. These are deliberate acts of deception. Nathan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're really going to do this after everything, after I helped Dad try to salvage his reputation, after I funded the PR campaign to fight back against your perfect image, you're going to destroy me. The room went silent. His lawyer grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back down, but Nathan shook him off. You stayed silent for 12 years when Dad blamed you for everything, Nathan said, his voice rising with desperation. You protected him even when he destroyed you. But now, when it's me, suddenly you care about justice. Suddenly you have principles. One of the board members spoke up. Mr. Wells, I suggest you stop talking. But Nathan wasn't listening. He was staring at me with something between betrayal and disbelief, as if I'd violated some fundamental rule of family loyalty by refusing to cover for him one more time. Dalton stood. The board has heard enough. Dalton Defense will immediately terminate all existing and pending contracts with Nathan Wells Development. We'll be cooperating fully with federal prosecutors. This meeting is concluded. The board members filed out their expressions grim. The prosecutors gathered their files, already discussing next steps with Captain Morris. Nathan's lawyer was on his phone, probably calling partners to discuss damage control. I packed up my laptop while Nathan stood frozen at the end of the table, watching his world collapse in real time. As I headed for the door, he followed me into the hallway. His lawyer called after him, but he ignored it. Why now? He asked, his voice breaking. After everything you've forgiven, everything you've let go, why is this the line? I stopped and turned to face him, seeing the little brother I'd once protected on playgrounds, the boy who'd cried when I left for West Point. I stayed silent when Father blamed me for his failures, I said quietly, because that only hurt me. I can't stay silent when your choices put soldiers at risk. That hurts people who can't defend themselves. He stared at me, comprehension slowly dawning. You think you're protecting people, but you're just punishing me for not being perfect like you." "I'm not perfect, Nathan. I'm just responsible. There's a difference." I walked away, leaving him standing in that hallway, finally facing consequences he'd spent his entire life believing he could avoid through charm connections or our family's willingness to protect him from reality. Justice doesn't need noise. 6 weeks after the boardroom confrontation, I stood in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, wearing my dress uniform, surrounded by senior military leadership and 200 guests who'd gathered for what the invitation had called a ceremony honoring distinguished service. I hadn't known the full scope of what was planned until 3 days earlier, when Colonel Morrison handed me the agenda and told me to prepare remarks. The room itself was designed to inspire awe: marble floors, flags representing every military branch, walls lined with portraits of Medal of Honor recipients. Natural light streamed through high windows, catching the polished brass and gleaming metals of the officers assembled in neat rows of chairs. I stood at attention beside Dalton while the Undersecretary of Defense read the citation for the Soldier's Medal that should have been awarded 12 years ago. His voice carried through the room, describing the mission in Afghanistan, the intelligence I'd analyzed, the decision to disobey orders, the 12 lives saved through what he called extraordinary moral courage and tactical excellence. As he spoke, I caught sight of my parents in the back row. My father sat in a wheelchair, a blanket across his lap, despite the warmth of the room. He'd deteriorated rapidly in the weeks since my mother's visit, the cancer eating away at him with ruthless efficiency. His face was gaunt, his shoulders hunched, but his eyes were fixed on the ceremony with an intensity that seemed to take all his remaining strength. My mother sat beside him, one hand gripping his, the other clutching a tissue. She was crying already, though the ceremony had barely begun. Nathan's absence was conspicuous. He was under house arrest pending trial, forbidden from leaving the state, his bail set at $2 million that had required liquidating nearly everything he owned. The wedding that was supposed to launch his ascension into high society had instead marked the beginning of his spectacular fall. The Undersecretary pinned the Soldier's Medal to my uniform, and I saluted as protocol required. But this was only the first of several presentations. A Bronze Star with Valor device for actions in Syria that had been classified until 3 weeks ago. A Defense Superior Service Medal for intelligence work that had prevented a terrorist attack in Germany. 2 meritorious service medals for operations I couldn't discuss even now. Each medal came with a citation read aloud, each one a piece of my career laid bare for examination. The cumulative effect was overwhelming, not because I'd forgotten what I'd done, but because I'd spent so long having it dismissed or diminished that hearing it acknowledged felt surreal. When the presentations concluded, Dalton stepped to the microphone. "Colonel Wells has served with distinction for 20 years, he said, his voice carrying the weight of personal knowledge. She represents the finest traditions of military service integrity, courage, selflessness. It's my honor to serve alongside her." Then it was my turn to speak. I approached the microphone, acutely aware of the cameras, the senior officers, the journalists covering the event. My prepared remarks sat in my pocket, carefully worded statements about service and duty. But standing there, seeing my mother's tears and my father's broken expression, feeling the weight of medals I'd earned through decisions that had cost me everything, except my honor, I knew I couldn't deliver safe platitudes. I didn't join the military to receive medals. I began, my voice steady despite the emotion churning underneath. I joined because I believed in service larger than myself, in duty that demanded everything and promised nothing except the satisfaction of work done right. I paused, scanning the audience, seeing young female officers in the crowd, their faces attentive and hopeful. These honors belong not just to me, but to every woman who's been called less than, for being strong, unfeminine, for being brave, difficult, for being competent. To every woman who's had to work twice as hard to receive half the recognition. To every woman who's been told she doesn't belong in spaces she's earned the right to occupy. My mother's sobbing had become audible. My father's hands gripped the wheelchair arms, his knuckles white. "Your value doesn't require their approval," I continued, looking directly at the young officers now. "Your achievements don't need validation from people who are threatened by your success. Rise higher. Serve better. Let your work speak so loudly that silence becomes impossible." The room erupted in applause, people rising to their feet. I saw tears on faces throughout the audience. Veterans who understood women who'd lived versions of my story, men who'd finally grasped what their female colleagues faced. The camera operator panned across the crowd and caught my father's face. Tears streamed down his cheeks, unchecked his expression, a twisted combination of pride and regret, love and loss. He was watching his daughter receive the honors he'd once dreamed of for himself, understanding too late what he'd destroyed through pride. As the ovation continued, a wave of dizziness swept over me. The room tilted slightly and I gripped the podium to steady myself. The sensation passed quickly, but not before I saw concern flash across Dalton's face in my peripheral vision. I smiled, nodded to the crowd, and stepped back from the microphone. The ceremony concluded with the playing of the national anthem, everyone standing at attention, hands over hearts. But peace never comes without a price. 6 months passed in a blur of work and medical appointments I kept rescheduling. The dizzy spells had become more frequent, the cough persistent enough that colleagues had stopped pretending not to notice. I told myself I'd see a doctor after the current project finished, after the upcoming briefing after next month. There was always a reason to postpone facing what my body was trying to tell me. Then my mother called at 3 a.m, and I knew before I answered what kind of news came at that hour. "Erica." Her voice was hollow with exhaustion. "Your father had a stroke. He's in hospice. They're saying it's a matter of days, maybe hours. If you want to see him, you need to come now." I was on a plane to Virginia by noon, having secured emergency leave with a single phone call. The flight felt interminable, and I spent it staring out the window at clouds that looked like cotton batting, thinking about all the conversations we'd never had, all the years we'd wasted in silent warfare. The hospice facility was smaller than I'd expected, a converted Victorian house on the outskirts of Millbrook with a garden that someone had tended carefully. Inside it smelled of antiseptic trying to mask decay, and hushed voices spoke in tones reserved for the dying. My mother met me in the hallway outside his room. She looked like she'd aged a decade in 6 months, her hair completely gray now, her face lined with grief that went deeper than imminent loss. "He's been asking for you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not with words he can't really speak anymore, but he keeps looking at the door and I know he's waiting." She pushed open the door, and I stepped into the small room that would be my father's last address on Earth. Medical equipment hummed quietly, monitors displaying vital signs that were clearly failing. The space was trying to be cheerful with pale yellow walls and a window overlooking the garden, but death had already claimed it. My father lay in the hospital bed, propped up on pillows connected to tubes and monitors. He'd always been a large presence, filling rooms with his voice and certainty. Now he looked shrunken, diminished, as if the cancer had burned through not just his body, but his very substance. His hair had gone completely white, wisps of it against the pillow. His skin had taken on a grayish tone, paper-thin over bones that seemed too prominent. His eyes opened when I approached the bed, and I saw recognition flicker in them. Then something else, relief maybe, or resignation. "Dad," I said, pulling a chair close to the bed. "I'm here." He tried to speak, his mouth working around words that wouldn't form properly. His right side was paralyzed from the stroke, his hand curled uselessly on the blanket, but his left hand moved slightly, reaching toward me with trembling fingers. I took his hand, feeling how cold it was, how fragile. The hand that had once gripped a rifle, signed military orders raised in anger during our arguments, now felt like bird bones wrapped in parchment. "I'm sorry." The words came out slurred but unmistakable. Tears leaked from his eyes, running down into the creases of his face. "My brave soldier." His voice broke on the last word, and more tears came. I reached for tissues from the bedside table and gently wiped his face, this man who'd spent my whole life refusing to show weakness. You became... He struggled, his breathing labored. What I couldn't be. I was jealous of my own daughter. The confession hung in the air between us, finally spoken aloud after decades of pretending otherwise. He was crying openly now, unable to control his emotions the way he'd always insisted real men should. I held his hand and let him cry. I didn't tell him it was okay, because it wasn't. I didn't offer false comfort or pretend the years of damage could be undone by a deathbed apology. But I could be present for this moment, could witness his breaking without adding to it. I loved you, he whispered. I just didn't know how to show it without diminishing myself. I know, I said quietly, and I realized it was true. I'd always known underneath everything that his cruelty came from his own pain. It didn't excuse, it didn't erase it, but it explained it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my colonel's insignia, the silver eagle I'd worn for 5 years, the symbol of rank I'd earned, despite his opposition because of his opposition in the space his rejection had created. I placed it on the table beside his bed where he could see it. You taught me what not to become, I said gently, meaning it without malice. You showed me what happens when pride matters more than love, when ego trumps integrity. And for that lesson, painful as it was, I'm grateful. You made me strong by making me choose between your approval and my principles. I chose principles, and it saved me. He stared at the insignia, tears still flowing. Then he looked at me, and something in his expression shifted. The tension that had defined him for so long seemed to release. He understood what I was offering, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that even his failures had served a purpose in shaping who I'd become. Proud, he breathed. So proud. I know, I said again. I finally know. His grip on my hand relaxed slightly. His breathing became more regular, more peaceful. He looked at me one more time, and his mouth curved into the faintest smile. Not happiness exactly, but relief. The relief of a man who'd carried a burden too long and finally been permitted to set it down. He smiled, then closed his eyes forever. 3 days after my father's funeral, I returned to the house to help my mother sort through his belongings. The task felt both necessary and impossible, reducing a man's life to boxes for donation, trash bags for disposal, a few precious items to keep. My mother moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching objects that had belonged to him, unable to decide what to do with any of it. Why don't you start with his office? She suggested, her voice thin with exhaustion. I can't face that room yet. It still smells like him. His office had always been off limits during my childhood, a sanctum where he retreated to brood over military histories and whatever grievances consumed him. I pushed open the door, expecting to feel some residual intimidation, but the room just looked sad now, dusty, and stale, abandoned mid-thought like a sentence cut off. I started with the desk drawers, finding the usual detritus of a life-old pens, rubber bands, tax documents dating back years. Then I noticed the filing cabinet in the corner, a heavy metal thing with a combination lock. My mother appeared in the doorway as I was examining it. I don't know the combination, she said. He never let me in there. Said it was old military documents, classified things I shouldn't see. I tried his birthday, his service number, my mother's birthday. Nothing worked. Then on impulse, I tried my own birthday, 042387. The lock clicked open. Inside were files, but not military documents. The first folder I pulled out contained newspaper clippings, dozens of them, all featuring my name. A local paper's mention of my acceptance to West Point. A military publication noting my promotion to captain. An article about female intelligence officers that included a brief quote from me. I pulled out another folder. More clippings, more articles. Every promotion, every commendation that had been publicly announced, every mission that had been written about in unclassified contexts. He'd collected them all, organized them by date, preserved them in plastic sleeves as if they were precious artifacts. "What is all this?" my mother asked, coming to stand beside me. "He was tracking my career," I said, my voice strange to my own ears. "Every mention, every achievement. He kept all of it." Folder after folder revealed the same pattern: printed articles from military journals, screenshots of Pentagon press releases, photographs me in uniform at various ceremonies pulled from official military websites. 10 years of documentation meticulously maintained hidden in a locked cabinet he'd let everyone believe contained classified materials. At the bottom of the cabinet, beneath all the files, lay a leather journal. I recognized it immediately as the one he'd always carried, the one I'd seen him writing in at odd moments, usually after too much whiskey. I opened it carefully, the leather soft with age and handling. The first entry was dated 12 years ago, shortly after the Afghanistan mission. She was right. I can barely write these words, but they're true. My daughter was right, and I was wrong. 12 soldiers came home to their families because she had the courage I lacked. The Board of Inquiry said I showed poor judgment. They were being kind. I showed cowardice. I was too proud to listen to intelligence that contradicted my plan, too arrogant to consider that my daughter might know better than I did. She saved lives. I nearly ended them, and I will never forgive her for making me face that truth. I flipped through the pages, reading entries that documented his internal war. Pride and resentment battling against grudging respect and hidden admiration. Entries where he raged against me, followed by entries where he admitted I'd done nothing wrong. The handwriting grew shakier over the years, the entries more painful. The final entry was dated 3 weeks before his stroke, his handwriting barely legible. "Watched video of Erica's Pentagon ceremony today." Margaret left her computer open. "I've watched it 17 times. She stood there receiving honors I once dreamed of, and she did it with grace I never possessed. She dedicated her service to women who'd been called less than for being strong. She was talking about how I treated her, how I made her feel. And she didn't rage or blame. She just rose higher. She became the soldier I failed to be. I spent her whole life punishing her for my inadequacy. I don't deserve her forgiveness, but I hope someday she knows I always knew she was extraordinary. I was just too broken to say it. Too broken to let her see that I saw her. If I could go back and do it all differently, I would. But all I have now is this journal full of regrets and a locked cabinet full of proof that I was paying attention even when I pretended not to be. She will never read this, but I need to write it anyway. I loved her. I was proud of her. I was just too small to tell her. I sat down on the floor, surrounded by folders and clippings and evidence of a love so twisted by pride that it had looked like hatred for most of my life. Tears came hot and uncontrollable, not angry tears, but grief for something that had existed but never been acknowledged, like a conversation held in a language neither of us could speak. My mother knelt beside me, picking up one of the folders, looking at the carefully preserved clippings. "He did this for years," she whispered. "I thought he was working in here. He was keeping track of you. He saw me," I said, my voice breaking. "All along he saw me. He just couldn't let me see him seeing me." We sat there together on the floor of his office, surrounded by the secret record of a father's pride and a daughter's accomplishments, evidence that love had existed underneath all the cruelty, trapped beneath layers of ego and shame so thick it could never break through to the surface where it might have mattered. I picked up my father's dress uniform from where it hung in his closet, ran my fingers over the insignia of his final rank, the ribbons he'd earned before everything fell apart. Then I stood and saluted it, holding the position for the full count, my hand steady. I finally saluted him, not as a father, but as a fallen soldier. 1 month after my father's death, I received a formal summons to meet with General Dalton at the Pentagon. The message came through official channels with a tone that suggested this wasn't a casual conversation. I made the drive from my apartment on a gray morning in November, the kind of day that felt suspended between seasons belonging to neither autumn nor winter. Dalton's office had been upgraded since his appointment as Special Advisor to the Secretary of Defense. Where before he'd occupied a modest space befitting a retired officer consulting on contracts, he now commanded a corner office on the Pentagon's third floor, with windows overlooking the Potomac and walls lined with photographs of him alongside presidents, foreign leaders, and military brass. He stood when I entered, gesturing to the leather chairs positioned near the window rather than the formal seating across from his desk. Whatever this meeting was about, he wanted it to feel like a conversation between equals rather than a briefing. "Colonel Wells, thank you for coming," he said, settling into the chair opposite me. "I've asked you here to discuss your future, specifically an opportunity that's become available." He opened a folder on the side table and handed me a document marked with security classifications. The title read Deputy Director of Defense Operations, and beneath it a job description that outlined responsibilities spanning strategic planning, interagency coordination, and direct advisory access to the Secretary of Defense. "This position reports directly to the Secretary," Dalton explained as I scanned the pages. "You'd be in every major strategic meeting, every critical decision point. You'd influence national security policy at the highest levels, shape operations across all theaters. It's the kind of role that defines careers, that puts officers in line for general officer ranks." I looked up from the document, seeing genuine enthusiasm in his expression. He believed he was offering me something extraordinary, something any ambitious officer would leap at without hesitation. "The Secretary specifically requested you," he continued. "Your work over the past year, both your operational excellence and how you handled the personal challenges with grace and integrity, has impressed people at levels you don't even know about. They see you as exactly the kind of leader the military needs more of." He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "Erica, this is what your entire career has been building toward. This is the culmination of 20 years of service. You'd have real power, real influence. You could shape the military into something better." I set the document down carefully on the table between us and looked out the window at the river below, at the city sprawling beyond it, at the monuments to power and legacy that dotted the landscape. "I'm honored by the offer," I said slowly, choosing my words with care. "And I'm grateful for the Secretary's confidence, but I need to decline." The silence that followed was profound. Dalton stared at me as if I'd spoken a language he didn't understand. "You're declining," he repeated. "Erica, I'm not sure you understand what this means. This position could make you one of the most influential officers in the entire military. You'd be shaping policy that affects millions of lives." "I understand exactly what it means," I said, meeting his eyes. "I've spent my entire life watching what the pursuit of rank and recognition does to people. My father destroyed himself and everyone around him chasing validation through military achievement. He spent decades bitter and broken because he couldn't accept that his identity and his rank weren't the same thing." I gestured toward the document. "That position isn't about service anymore. It's about power and influence and sitting in rooms where important decisions get made. It's about being someone rather than doing something, and I've learned the difference matters." Dalton sat back in his chair, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You think accepting this would make you like your father? I think command means nothing without peace," I said quietly. "My father had rank and respect and a career he was proud of, and it still wasn't enough. He still died bitter and alone, having wasted years on resentment because his sense of self was so tied to his uniform that losing rank meant losing everything. I don't want that life. I'd rather have a quiet life than an important title." "What do you want then?" Dalton asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "To do good work without needing recognition for it. To serve without tying my worth to my rank. To have relationships that aren't casualties of ambition. My father taught me what not to become, and this position, as honored as I am by it, feels like exactly what he would have wanted, what he would have killed for." I paused, feeling the weight of what I was saying, what I was giving up. "I want to be free of that hunger. I want to prove that you can serve excellently without making service into an identity that destroys everything else." Dalton was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled under his chin. Then he smiled, a genuine expression of something like admiration. "Then you already outrank us all," he said softly. Most officers I know, myself included, can't separate who we are from what we do. We've made the uniform into our entire sense of self. You're choosing something harder to be someone complete outside of rank and recognition. He stood and extended his hand. I stood to shake it, feeling the firmness of his grip, the respect in the gesture. The offer stands if you change your mind, he said. But I suspect you won't, and that's probably the most impressive thing about you. I left his office and walked through the Pentagon's corridors, past officers hurrying to meetings, past enlisted personnel, moving with purpose, past walls covered with military history and tradition. I felt lighter than I had in years, as if I'd set down a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying. As I pushed through the exit doors into the November air, a coughing fit seized me with sudden violence. I grabbed the railing of the steps, doubling over as my lungs spasmed. The fit went on longer than usual, sharp pain radiating through my chest. When it finally subsided, I tasted blood. I sat down on the Pentagon steps, breathing carefully, and pulled out my phone to finally make the doctor's appointment I'd been avoiding for months. For the first time, I felt free. The appointment I made after leaving the Pentagon turned into a series of appointments, each one revealing something worse than the last. Chest X-rays showed masses. CT scans revealed metastasis. A biopsy confirmed what the oncologist's face had already told me: stage 4 adenocarcinoma aggressive, and advanced already spread to my lymph nodes and liver. I sat in the consultation room 1 year and 2 weeks after my father's death, listening to Dr. Chen explain treatment options with the careful optimism doctors use when they know the prognosis is terminal but want to offer hope anyway. With aggressive chemotherapy and radiation, we might extend your timeline to 8 or 10 months, she said, pulling up scans on her computer screen. Without treatment, I'd estimate 3 to 4 months, possibly less. Colonel Wells, I have to ask, how long have you been experiencing symptoms? Over a year, I said quietly. The cough started before my brother's wedding. It got progressively worse. Her expression shifted from professional concern to something closer to dismay. You've been living with this for over a year without seeking treatment. The pain must have been significant. It was manageable, I said, which was a lie. It had been brutal, especially in the last few months. But I'd learned to live with pain, to function through it, to treat it as just another mission parameter to work around. Why didn't you come in sooner? Dr. Chen asked, genuine confusion in her voice. With earlier intervention, we might have had more options. I didn't know how to explain that I'd needed those months, that I'd had things to resolve that mattered more than extending a life I'd been ready to complete. So I just said, I had things I needed to finish first. She scheduled me for chemotherapy, despite my obvious reluctance, prescribed pain medication I knew I wouldn't take, except when absolutely necessary, and gave me pamphlets about palliative care that I accepted politely and threw away in the parking lot. Back in my apartment, I sat on my couch and pulled out my phone. I opened the video camera and propped it up on the coffee table, adjusting the angle until my face was centered in the frame. Then I pressed record. Mom, I began, my voice steady, despite the subject matter. If you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and I need you to understand some things that I couldn't explain while I was alive. I paused, gathering my thoughts, choosing words that would make sense of choices that probably looked senseless from the outside. I suspected I was sick before Nathan's wedding. The symptoms were there: the cough, the fatigue, the pain. But I chose not to get diagnosed, not to seek treatment, because I knew that if I did, everything that followed would become about my illness. Every interaction with the family would be colored by pity or guilt or the performance of reconciliation that comes when people know you're dying. I shifted in my seat, feeling the familiar ache in my chest that had become my constant companion. I didn't come back to fight them, Mom. I came back to say goodbye. Not the kind of goodbye you say when you know it's the last time that would have made everything false, made them treat me differently. I needed to face them one last time as myself, not as a dying woman seeking deathbed absolution or forcing deathbed apologies. I needed to close that chapter before closing the final one. Tears were forming, but I blinked them back, determined to finish. When Dad humiliated me at the wedding when he called me a desk soldier in front of everyone, I wasn't there to defend myself or prove him wrong. I was there to see if I could stand in that room, accept his worst, and still know my own worth. When Dalton showed up, it wasn't revenge. I felt it was relief. Relief that the truth came out not because I forced it, but because truth has its own gravity. I thought about the past year, about every decision I'd made, every confrontation I'd chosen or avoided. Choosing to prosecute Nathan wasn't about punishing family. It was about refusing to let my silence protect corruption just because we share DNA. And refusing the Pentagon position wasn't about giving up. It was about finally understanding that my value doesn't come from rank or recognition or what other people think I should want. I leaned forward, looking directly into the camera. I've had a good life, Mom. Not an easy one. Not one that looked like success to most people. But I did work that mattered. I saved lives. I served with integrity. And in the end, I got to choose how I spent my final year, not in hospitals, fighting for months I didn't need, but reclaiming the dignity that our family spent decades trying to take from me. I smiled, feeling the truth of what I was saying. Dad found out too late that he'd been wrong about me. But he did find out. He died knowing I was everything he couldn't be, and that knowledge gave him something like peace. That's more than most people get. And I got to see him really see me, even if only at the very end. That was enough. I reached forward to stop the recording, then paused. Don't grieve for time we didn't have, Mom. Grieve for the daughter you had but couldn't see because you were too busy managing Dad's ego. I forgive you for that. But I need you to forgive yourself too. And I need you to know that despite everything, I turned out exactly who I wanted to be. I stopped the recording and immediately sent it to my mother's email with a message. Don't open this until you receive word that I've passed. I love you. This will explain everything. But I knew my mother. I knew she'd open it the moment she saw it, unable to resist, unable to wait. And maybe that was what I wanted for her to know while I was still alive, even if we never spoke about it directly. My phone buzzed 30 minutes later. A text from my mother. I'm coming to Washington. Don't tell me no. I typed back, Okay, Mom. My time was short, but my story wasn't. 5 years had passed since Erica Wells closed her eyes for the last time in a quiet hospice room, her mother holding one hand and General Dalton holding the other. She'd lasted 4 months after her diagnosis, working until the final 2 weeks, refusing to let illness define her ending. She'd gone peacefully without drama, the way she'd lived most of her life, with quiet determination and no need for spectacle. Now, on a brilliant spring morning in Northern Virginia, 200 people gathered at the Colonel Erica Wells Center for Women in Military Leadership for its annual commemoration ceremony. The facility occupied 10 acres of land that had once been slated for commercial development until Dalton had leveraged his connections and Erica's story to secure it for a different purpose. The main building was modern but understated, all clean lines and large windows designed to feel welcoming rather than institutional. Inside were classrooms, counseling offices, a library focused on women's military history, and residential space for service members attending the center's leadership programs. Over the past 5 years, more than 3,000 women had passed through its programs, receiving mentorship, advocacy, and support for navigating military careers in an institution still learning to fully embrace them. Margaret Wells stood at the podium in front of the assembled crowd, her posture straight despite her 73 years. She'd transformed in the years since Erica's death, as if her daughter's passing had released her from some invisible constraint. Her hair was silver now, worn short and practical. She'd left the house in Millbrook, sold it and most of its contents, and moved to a small apartment near the center where she volunteered 3 days a week. Thank you all for being here. Margaret began, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. 5 years ago I lost my daughter, but in losing her I finally understood who she'd always been. Not the difficult child her father portrayed. Not the forgotten daughter her hometown dismissed, but a woman of extraordinary courage who changed lives by refusing to shrink herself for other people's comfort. In the audience, young women in uniform sat alongside retired officers, civilian advocates, and family members of service members who'd been helped by the center's programs. Their faces reflected attention and respect, understanding they were part of something that mattered. My daughter taught us that quiet women change history. Margaret continued, her voice strengthening with emotion. She never raised her voice to be heard. She never demanded recognition or fought for acknowledgement. She simply lived so authentically, served so excellently, that silence became impossible. People tried to dismiss her, diminish her, make her invisible. But you can't hide a light that bright, no matter how hard you try. Near the back of this gathering, Nathan Wells sat in a folding chair wearing a simple suit that had seen better days. He'd served 26 months in minimum security prison for fraud, lost everything he'd built, and emerged broken in ways that prison couldn't explain. He was sober now, working in construction, living in a modest apartment, and attending therapy twice a week. He came to this ceremony every year, sitting in the back, never speaking, just witnessing the legacy of the sister he'd failed to see, until it was too late. General Dalton sat in the front row, now fully retired from both military service and corporate leadership. He'd dedicated his remaining active years to establishing this center, using his influence and Erica's story to secure funding, accreditation, and military support. He served as chairman of the board, attended every graduation, and personally mentored a dozen women each year. His presence gave the center credibility and weight that ensured it would outlast any individual effort. Margaret's speech concluded with words Erica had recorded in one of her final video messages, meant for occasions exactly like this. To every woman who's been called too much or not enough, too aggressive or too soft, too ambitious, or not dedicated enough, you're not the problem. The systems that can't handle your excellence are the problem. Keep serving, keep rising. Your presence changes what's possible for everyone who comes after you. The crowd rose in standing ovation, and Margaret stepped back from the podium, her eyes wet but her expression peaceful. She'd found purpose in preserving her daughter's legacy, in helping other women navigate challenges she'd watched Erica face alone. After the ceremony, people gathered around the entrance to the main building, where a stone wall bore an inscription that had become famous in military circles. The words were carved in letters large enough to be read from across the courtyard, Erica's voice preserved in granite. To those who sit behind desks so others can stand on solid ground. Below those words, in smaller but equally permanent lettering, Colonel Erica Wells. He called her a desk soldier, but even from a desk she commanded the battlefield, 1985 to 2027. The phrase that had been meant as mockery spoken with wine-fueled contempt at a wedding designed to celebrate someone else's success had been transformed into a statement of purpose. Desk soldier, the insult had been reclaimed, redefined, turned into a recognition that leadership takes many forms, that strategy matters as much as combat, that the people making critical decisions behind desks were commanding real battlefields with real consequences. Young women in uniform stopped to take photos in front of the wall, touching the engraved letters, as if drawing strength from the stone itself. Officers brought their daughters to show them what service could look like. Veterans who'd served with Erica made pilgrimages to stand before the monument and remember a colleague who'd shown them what integrity looked like under pressure. Margaret stood beside Dalton, both of them watching the crowd interact with Erica's words. She'd hate this attention, Margaret said with a small smile. She'd say it's too much, that she was just doing her job. She would, Dalton agreed, but that's exactly why she deserves it. The people who seek monuments rarely earn them. The people who earn them rarely seek them. A young female captain approached Margaret hesitantly, holding a worn photo. Mrs. Wells, I wanted you to know your daughter was my commanding officer for 6 months in Germany. She wrote me a letter of recommendation that changed my career. When I felt like quitting, I'd read it and remember what she saw in me. I wouldn't be here without her. Margaret took the woman's hand, tears spilling freely now. Thank you for telling me. She'd be proud of you. As the sun moved across the Virginia sky, casting long shadows from the building that bore her name, Erica Wells' story continued to unfold through the lives she'd touched, the women she'd inspired, and the institution that ensured her example would outlive her years. Her father had called her a desk soldier, meaning to diminish her to reduce her service to something inconsequential and forgettable. And that's how a mockery became a monument. Erica Wells' story reminds us that true strength isn't measured in titles or rank, but in the quiet courage to live authentically, despite opposition from the people who should support us most. She didn't need her father's approval to validate her worth. She didn't need public recognition to confirm her achievements. She simply did the work, saved the lives, and served with integrity until her final breath. Her legacy wasn't built through revenge or bitterness, but through the consistent choice to rise above cruelty and let her character speak louder than her critics ever could. What strikes me most about Erica's journey is how many of us have faced smaller versions of her struggle. Maybe not on the scale of military service or national recognition, but we've all encountered people who diminished our accomplishments, questioned our capabilities, or made us feel invisible in our own stories. We've all had moments where we had to choose between seeking approval from those who withheld it or finding validation within ourselves. Erica chose herself, and in doing so, she became someone whose impact outlived her years and transformed mockery into meaning. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever been underestimated by family or colleagues? Have you watched someone close to you struggle with a parent's conditional love or a sibling's jealousy? What would you have done in Erica's position when faced with the choice between protecting family and pursuing justice? These questions matter because they help us understand our own values and the legacies we're building through our daily choices. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about your own relationships or the quiet heroes in your life, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. We share stories like this every week. Narratives about real human struggles, moral complexity, and the kind of courage that doesn't make headlines but changes everything. Your subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories to people who need to hear them. And please leave a comment below. Tell us about someone you know who showed quiet strength in the face of dismissal. Share your own experience of being underestimated and how you overcame it, or simply let us know what part of Erica's story affected you most. Your comments create a community where we can all learn from each other's experiences and find strength in knowing we're not alone in these struggles. Hit that like button if you believe that grace can be sharper than steel, that dignity matters more than revenge, and that the most powerful victories are the ones fought with integrity rather than anger. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that their value doesn't require anyone else's approval. Thank you for spending this time with Erica's story. Thank you for honoring her memory by listening. And thank you for being part of a community that believes quiet strength can change the world. Until next time, remember that your story matters, your courage counts, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to become small for someone else's comfort.